Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the October meeting of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. I'd like to start with a call to the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. While still standing, today the BET received tragic news of one of our members' brother, I feel I've done this before, suddenly passed away. David Norton, Mr. Norton's younger brother, passed away to a sudden illness, and the family doesn't have the details or anything, but that was 4 o'clock this morning, and I'm looking at Mr. Norton here, and I'm just in amazement. Art, on behalf of the BET, we're very sorry, Art. Thank you. Sad. Thank you, everyone. We'll get a moment of silence before we sit, though, please. Thank you. Catherine, would you have the minutes reflect a moment of silence for David Norton? Mr. Norton, you're a man who shows strength. Okay, with that brings us to item number 2. Our routine applications, and I'll call on Mr. Drake, clerk of the board.
We have 2 routine applications today. PD1 from the police department, $61,575 approval to use funds. And PD3, also from the police department, $94,951, also approval to use funds.
Is that removed? Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, discussion on these items? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining. That item is carried 12-0-0. That brings us to our non-routine, ED3. I will call on Mr. Johnson on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move ED3, Board of Education, $332,385, release of conditions on temporary salaries for school lunch fund.
Item has been moved in second. I'm sorry, I'm doing some administrative paperwork here. Committee report first, please.
The Budget Committee last week heard a report from the CFO, Jim Rickey, and John Hopkins, the Food Service Director. They appeared before us to review special committee findings on ways to improve the operating revenues, expenses, and reducing, and also to reduce growing deficits of the school lunch fund. They are considering a number of different items, including outsourcing perhaps in the future, pricing changes, better marketing, promotional programs, and services. The committee had numerous questions about this. In our budget for this current fiscal year, as well next year, we did separate out the line item for school lunch fund so we could keep track of that. But the committee agreed to release these funds, which represent 25% of the total temporary salaries. The committee voted 4-0 to approve.
Discussion on the item? Mr. Blankley, you were also on the special working group. Did you have a report for us this evening at all?
I'm not sure I could report, Mr. Chairman, but just a few remarks. We have in front of us the members of the school administration. I sat on this committee. We had half a dozen meetings or so with ultimately Jim Rickey, before that Ben Brannion, and members were Debbie and a lady called Sophie Dowling from PTAC. And as Mark has said, we were charged with finding ways to try and bring the school lunch fund to break even. The report which we produced, which we all approved of, was made to the Board of Ed and was passed, I believe, unanimously, and also presented to the Budget Committee, where it passed 4-0 as well. My observations on the whole matter were as follows. That there'd been a lot of talk beforehand about outsourcing as a possible way to bring the lunch fund to break even, and I brought to this, I feel, some experience because the business model of my company is actually outsourcing services to organizations and municipalities, as a matter of fact. And so I tried to bring a businessman's perspective to the situation. So first of all, I tried to see if there was any glaring problem or deficiency, and there was clearly none. So looking at the two major components of costs and revenues, first of all, costs, it seemed to me that any business to which this whole enterprise might be outsourced would be looking at ways to increase efficiencies, for example, with bulk purchasing or on the staffing side. And it seemed to me that over the past few years, all the cost-saving measures that could be taken in those areas had already been taken by the school administration, which was very gratifying to see. So it seemed to me that all the problems were really on the revenue side of the matter, and a couple of remarks to make about that. We're dealing with a volatile kind of population. These are teenagers, and when they get to the high school, they're thinking about ways of being more independent, going off campus, and so forth. And if there's an opportunity to combine that with buying a school meal, then, or buying a meal rather, not a school meal, but buying a meal off campus, then that is something that they would be inclined to do. And of course, that results in less revenue, less volume for the school lunch fund. I may say, when we made a site visit, I was stunned, standing in front of the high school, a bunch of kids. I said, "What are you doing here?" "Oh, we're waiting for our lunch." And it arrived, pizza by taxi. And it seemed to me that this is perhaps only in Greenwich, or perhaps only in America, but an astonishing manifestation of school lunches, which I never experienced when I was at school, the basis of which was, here's your lunch, you will eat it and you will enjoy it. Seriously, on the revenue side, we forewent $140,000 of contribution from the state and the feds by relinquishing, or we needed to relinquish the national lunch standards, and the decision to do this was made 8-0 by the Board of Education on the basis that if we imposed the standards, the national standards, then the likely loss of volume would be severe. I have two comments on that. One is, it seemed to me that decision made unanimously by the Board of Education was correct. But I would also say this, that if I had disagreed with their opinion, then I would still have accepted it because it was the opinion of the Board. And I believe that it is the duty of this Board to listen very carefully to what other departments and other boards have to say to us. But as it happened, I did agree with them on this particular point. We also have the burden, I'm not sure that's the correct word, but we certainly do have the burden of providing free what's the word I'm looking for? Reduced lunches. And it's a feature of these kind of programs that the government makes contribution to, that the contributions they make are reducing over time. We see that in so many areas of our national life, but that is certainly happening here, in addition to which the percentage of children receiving the free and reduced meals is increasing. So that is another contributory factor to the loss of volume and loss of revenue. And again, to emphasize, it is on the revenue side where I think we have issues with the program. So the measures that the administration were already taking and which were discussed in our committee, as Mark has already said, finding ways to market the program better, but also combined with increasing prices and getting in outside sources of food that the children seem to favor. So there's been a lot of talk heading into our committee about Chicken Joe's coming to the high school. It eventually turned out that the schools entered into a contract with Garden Catering. And the result of all of these measures in the early days seems to be indicating that this is having some traction. So it is, on the volume side, getting the numbers of meals that we provide up and getting the price up we're already ahead of where we were last year. So I think some of the shocking numbers that I think some of the members of this board were looking at are probably not going to materialize, and I think that's a good thing. So all in all, Mr. Chairman, my concluding remark is that I found the school administration to have already done a lot of the things that an outsourcing independent company would have done, and I think the signs are good that we have this program under control. We are not going to get to break even, at least not in the short run, but we are certainly making sure that it is not getting out of control.
Further discussion? Mr. Goldrick, Ms. Weissler?
Yeah, this was brought up, I think, in March of this year, and I think my opinion is still the same. And the fundamental belief of mine is that we should not be trying to balance the budget on the backs of nutritional standards that are debased. I further find it rather sad that we are trying to reduce expenses on the school lunch services when 63 of the 75 workers in that division earn poverty wages. Those 63 people altogether earn between less than $17,000 a year to just over $19,000. And they have a very hard time when school is not in session. And for one of the wealthiest towns on the planet to be trying to balance its small deficit on the backs of those workers, I think is very sad. I will also point out that I don't think that we should be trying to make this break even when we're talking about the nutrition provided to children who are growing. No more than we should try to balance the budget for the library, school libraries, or the chemistry department. We should be looking at providing the best nutrition to all of the students we possibly can, period. I would point out that I reached out to Rosa DeLauro from just up the road, who had a few words to say on this. When I mentioned that, the idea was that we were afraid that our a la carte menu items sales would go down if we adopted the terms of the Healthy and Hunger-Free Kids Initiative. She said that it was very sad that the Board of Education in this town would put those a la carte menu items above the nutrition of the schools. And let me also point out that when this decision was made to opt out of this program in, 3 years ago now, it was against the recommendation of our food services director and the superintendent, the administration of the public schools. And it was an 8-0 vote. But I would point out that this is something that Democrats have fought very hard for. And it's very sad that not one elected Democrat in this town could stand up for that. Now, I would say it's about $200,000 a year deficit, that we are foregoing, about $150,000 from the feds and a roughly $50,000 certificate, nutrition certificate we would have gotten from the state of Connecticut had we opted in. And over 90% of the school systems in the state, as well as the nation, have opted in. I think this is just something where we say that we spend what we need to spend to give all children the best nutrition. We steer them away from the junk food. And if that means their a la carte sales go down somewhat, so be it. It's not our job. We're not a restaurant. We're not a deli. And this board should not be requiring the public schools to break even on this particular fund.
Ms. Weissler?
I was going to say, I was heartened to hear the report last week at the Budget Committee that the school food services are taking some aggressive steps in terms of increasing revenues, increasing marketing efforts with the attempt to reduce the deficit. I mean, I look at it somewhat, if it's about $500,000, whatever we're subsidizing this year, that money could be allocated to teachers to higher value-added services in the Board of Education. So at this point, I would like to see, continue to come back every quarter to see what type of progress you're making on these initiatives. However, personally, I would not take outsourcing off the table. I mean, if we look at your report, I mean, there are far as you know, 5 major municipalities in Fairfield County doing it right now: Stamford, Fairfield, Wilton, Westport, and Weston. And I think certainly you can basically create a contract to achieve the nutritional standards. I realize from the report that there will still be costs, which would be administrative costs as well as facility costs, but I think we heard last week that that was about $230,000. So I think we need, as a BET, to look at the difference between that $250,000 we might have to pay if it were outsourced and what we would currently be paying under your initiatives going forward.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, first I want to thank John for all the work he's done on this committee, representing all of us. I think his business background was very constructive in terms of working on this committee. In the Budget Committee, I asked that, if possible, that this committee reassemble in 6 months just to evaluate the progress, and so that they can tweak this report if needed. But I think we should give the committee's recommendations, the opportunity to perform, and it sounds like they're making progress already. So I support the committee's efforts and their recommendations.
If I may, on the second page of the executive summary, I like this statement. It says, recognize all efforts will be made to keep the delta as small as possible. It recommends the BOE and the BET together. Is that a misprint? No, it says together. Identify the best way to address food services programs delta. So this has been popping up, and we're now approaching about $500,000 a year. And if the town wants to not run a school lunch fund like it did typically for umpteen years as a standalone, here's what I think we're missing. And I don't want to say that I might be agreeing with one of our fellow members in some ways. What we haven't done and what we need to do is we haven't benchmarked population meals served. I went to that high school. We served a lot of meals, and the population was even greater than the amount of attendees was greater, the amount of meals served was greater. Obviously, everybody, I'm looking at our Board of Ed members here, we know that the challenges and the school schedule and the amount of time for lunch and the amount of revenue that we can only generate in 4 22-minute segment lunches or whatever they are. The point is, what we're not doing is we're not looking at what the revenue is. We keep cutting costs. You've heard we've reduced the staff. At one time we had 25 full-timers, now we're down to half that, and part-timers, so approximately. We need to look at what our potential is for, what's our revenue capture? How many of the 2,700 students that go to Greenwich High School are buying a meal? How many? What was that 5 years ago? What was that 10 years ago? Because I think when we didn't have this problem, the only thing that the town introduced is to pick up the fixed charges. But according to the report, your free and reduced lunch is taking a bite out of this loss of about $75K. The weather, but I'm sure we had bad weather when I went to school also, is eating up about $30K. The schedule change with the half-days and development days, that's about $30K. And then obviously the change on the grant from the state makes up about $140,000. But we need to do this because as we approach the budget, we can't go to a budget without a decision on what we're going to do. And I think there are more steps to doing this. I think we really should be, what's the average high school in Fairfield County per capita? What are we doing as far as lunches? In other words, does Stanford have how many population? How many meals do they serve? We're not doing that. And I think that this is a number that's getting bigger because somebody's going to look back after 5 or 6 years and say, this is a $3 or $4 million issue that's accumulated over time. And that's what we don't want to have happen. So I'm glad we'll get the quarterly reports, but at the same token, I think there needs to be sort of the count. We need to do the math. And I'm willing to help, by the way, because I did read that right together, right? So with that, anybody else have anything? Okay. ED3, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? That is carried. Brings us to the assessors, 1200. I put it down, am I right?
That's required.
Yeah.
12
Yeah, I think I had it right. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the BET. I would like to present the assessor's report for October 2015. First item I'd like to mention is that the first selectman has approved the one-month extension for the 2015 grand list, and he has he notified the Office of Policy and Management on October 14th, so we are set with the extension. Before you, there's two handouts. There's one of which is a calendar, which I'd like to point out a couple of things on it. First of all, it's going to show the tentative schedule for the informal hearings. Those are the hearings with the revaluation companies. In addition, there's also the presentations that I'm on the calendar for so far. I'm sure there might be a couple other asks in addition, and I'll be happy to do those. And in one other item that we're going to do is we're going to extend our office hours. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, the weeks we are having informal hearings, we are also going to extend my office hour till 7 o'clock at night, so that if anybody has any questions or needs to come into my office and get some information, we will be there for them. We don't have any, we have a couple Saturdays there, but my office will also be open on those Saturdays that we do have those hearings. Okay? There's also a PowerPoint presentation that we are currently putting together. That's what we're going to be presenting to the Round Hill associations and various other associations that I will be speaking before. It is not complete yet because I don't have the final numbers yet. I expect to have the final numbers for the commercial properties by the end of the week, all reviewed and finalized. I'm assuming by next week I will have reviewed most of the residential and still planning to send out the notices by the week of November 9th. That being said, I will give you a little preview as to what's happening with the grand list. If you turn to page 3, you'll see that this is preliminary values for the residential properties so far. You'll see that overall, I think the grand list is probably going to go up somewhere between 3 and 5% overall. That being said, you'll see that the residential land values are going down about 19%, but building values, the actual improvements in structures, are going up a great deal, almost 40%. Overall, that equates to roughly increase about 4.5% on the residential side. That is also subject to informal hearings in the BAA. So that's where we are. Preliminary. These are not final numbers yet, but this is kind of an overview as to where we stand so far. Okay? Any questions?
The other column says as of 2014.
That's our grand list.
Right.
Yeah.
But that appraisal is dated when? 5 years ago?
It's our 14 grand list based upon 2010 valuation.
Lauren?
Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused, because in the previous page, you break down the grand list, including
That's our-
personal property and...
Yes, that's our 2000 and that's our entire 2014 grand list. That was the last one that I've done.
True, but it also includes commercial.
Yes, I don't have the commercials yet.
Oh, that's all right. So
Okay.
this is just residential, which is
Yes.
I thought it was.
Right.
Okay, that was my question.
Commercials are going up, probably 5 to 7% overall.
Mr. Raymer?
So ballpark guess, overall commercial, residential, motor vehicle, all of it rolled together, the entire grand list, what are you expecting will be the change in the total value of grand list to grand list? Any
Increase
guess?
of
I know it's a
3 to
guess.
5%.
3 to 5%?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would imagine some, unless, like I said, these are strictly preliminary. Don't hold me to this if by chance. I can be quite certain that the grand list is going to go up. I am certain of that. Okay. Yes.
Marty, is there a rule of thumb that if it's going up 4.5%, that after appeals and everything else, is no rule of thumb that you would use?
Let me tell you, we've done something a little bit drastic here, in the sense that we are changing the philosophy, so to speak. We are putting more value in our structures than in our land values. And so that is not going to, we're not going to have this easy, well, then everybody's going up 3.5% to 4%. Because we're coming down on the land values and going up on our structures, it's going to wash out quite differently than it has in the past. Now, there's a great benefit for this, for the town of Greenwich. In the interim, from 2015 to 2020, instead of getting rather anemic growth of, 0.3% or 0.3% or 0.35%, we will actually be adding more to our grand list because we're actually adding to not a $100 structure, but a $200 per square foot structure. So our increase in the interim will actually be better than it has been in the past because we're putting more emphasis and more value onto the structures, not onto the land. We're adding value onto the structures. That's our growth from year to year to year. Y'all following me there?
Yes, and will that generate more appeals?
Probably. Yes, we'll prepare for them. But there's a number it sticks out in my head, and I presented this to Bill and Leslie. We had in the 2010, 2,479 structures, not the land value, but structures, actual houses, dwellings that people are living. Their 100% value is less than $100,000. I actually had structures that are under $50,000. So much value was in the land. The overall assessment was not bad. It was not off. But the allocation between land and structure, I think, was a bit lopsided. So when we do this, we're kind of it's a different philosophy. It's a different step. But I think first of all, I think it's certainly much more defendable. People know what you're building a house. We know what the value per square foot of a house is. It's much more defendable, and I think ultimately in the long run, it helps the town of Greenwich in those interim years. So our growth should be better than the 0.3, assuming that everything remains the same. Okay.
Mark? Mr. Jones?
So Lauren, so looking at residential versus commercial, the fact that commercial buildings generally cost more to build than a residential, is that why that's going up a little bit
Yep.
more than the residential?
Yes. Yeah.
So will that shift the overall value of those properties more to the commercial and less to the residential?
We did the same thing. We ended up coming down a bit on the land valuations, but the structures themselves are going up.
Well, that doesn't answer his question. His question was, is there going to be then an incremental shift of value
Not-
Commercial side.
residential towards the commercial?
Our commercial valuation is only we have 700 commercials. Our commercial properties, we don't have, I think we have $4 or $5 billion worth of commercial properties. So the majority of our valuation is residential. So that's what's kind of the predominant. So even though we do have a bit of an increase in the commercial overall, it's not a great percentage of the overall grand list.
One more question.
Hang on, Ms. Tarkany was first, then Mr.
I
Wildred.
just wanted further comment here. Of course, this is all reflecting the sales that we have, residential sales. It reflects the land sales, and it reflects the sales in the neighborhoods. So this is reflecting a trend that has been occurring, I would sort of say, since the financial crisis, but certainly that we began to see a little bit in 2010, but certainly more in the sales numbers that the department has been using to do this revaluation since the 2010 revaluation. Is that?
Yes.
It's reflective.
Yes. Ultimately, our assessments are supposed to be 70% of fair market value. And, the end result is, building costs and expenses have continued to go up. So therefore, buildings and assessments on those structures should be going up as well.
Mr. Goldert, Mr. Norton next.
Lawyers have a saying that you shouldn't ask a question, the answer to which you don't already know. But since I'm not a lawyer, I'll ask you. Does this, in terms of different neighborhoods, does this shift mean that there will be relatively higher tax assessments for, say, backcountry structures relative to smaller plots in Riverside or Coscob? And when you mention 3 to 5%, that's relative to the 2010 valuations, right?
Correct.
So when we're looking at the grand list for this year, as opposed to last year, are we still looking at a 30 basis point increase year over year, or will that be larger as well?
I believe that our increase would be larger. It will be larger from 15 on. As far as what is actually happening neighborhood to neighborhood, we'll have to wait on that a minute. In the next couple of weeks, I'll have all the final answers to that. But I can say that certain neighborhoods are going down, certain neighborhoods are going up. That's why we do these revaluations every few years, and it's not across the board. It's basically it's reflecting what's going on in the market.
Could I just follow up on one thing? When you mentioned the shift from land to structures, is that something you implemented? Was the town doing something unusual that you have corrected, or where did that come out?
No, I think actually what as Leslie had mentioned previously, we're trying to reflect what's going on out there in the real estate market. And I think it's quite evident, it's quite clear that newer structures, larger structures, there is and actually in land and vacant land itself it's on sale in certain areas of town, depending on where you are. But when I do this, I have to make sure that my model on the residential side is able to reflect all the homes on either extreme, no matter where they are within the town. If I have the same house up north versus the same house down south, I should have the same value on that structure. So therefore, that's why you'll see a larger increase in structures. And I think that's the sales reflect that.
Mr. Norton?
Yes, Laura, the shift that you're talking about, valuation of the residential improvements, it seems to me that is really a move toward replacement value methodology. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that and the real estate market, new houses sell like that. Everybody, and I think that's ultimately what the market is telling us.
Well, so the insurance industry uses a replacement
Yes.
replacement value methodology, and so that it seems to me that that's where you're headed. You're headed in that direction. Maybe not quite the way in which the
Well, I'm not. Yeah, it's not replacement. No, there's still depreciation. It's not replacement cost new per se. But as far as the
replacement cost minus depreciation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Blankley?
So, Lauren, just to confirm, land values have gone down. Is this corroborated by what is happening to unimproved land? And how does this compare with what may be happening in neighboring towns? Have you done that comparison?
I haven't done that comparison. Yeah. Yeah. I've been concentrating specifically on the town of Greenwich at the moment.
I just wonder if this is something that is happening overall in Fairfield County, or what? This is.
I'll make a comment here.
This is something of a surprise to me, I must say. What you're suggesting to us this evening.
Mr.
Yeah,
Mr. Finger, one or two of you? Got Leslie?
I would just like to add to your comment here, John. Quite frankly, I've been very concerned about our values relative to other communities. And, when you look and also why I've been concerned about the use of the equalized grand list. When you look at the grand list that Greenwich sends to the state, our grand list is more than 60% greater than the grand list for Stanford. Our grand list is more than, it's greater than the sum of Stanford and Norwalk. And I can go on and make these examples. And so I'm always inquiring of Lauren, as Bill knows, why, when you see so many, wonderful commercial buildings and, all the waterfront and some of these other communities, why is ours so great? And, I think, though, that it's difficult because of these disparities to actually make some of the comparisons that you're talking about, which, I'd actually be very interested, we all should be interested in, but it's very difficult to get these numbers.
Okay, can I get a motion to
Before
assess?
we do it, I just want to reference my
Yes.
court cases.
Yeah.
I see the courts were in session the past month.
Yes, we got a couple more done.
So I move that we approve the assessor's report.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, moves us to the controls report. Good evening, Peter. How are you?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. I have a couple of items. I'll start on page 1. The annual audit being done by McGladrey is ahead of schedule. We don't have the problems or issues we had last year with the reconciling with the tax collector's office. The quality data services is up and running. Few minor bugs, but we're ahead of schedule, and we're scheduled to go before Art Norton's group the end of November, I think it's the 23rd, with a draft report, and then we will go with a audit, CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and the 2 single audits, state and federal, and a management letter for the BET in December, which we do normally. And then we transmit to the Office of Policy and Management by December 31st. I'll move on to ADP if there's no questions on the audit.
Just to follow up on what you just said about the audit committee. The audit committee meeting for the month of November has been changed until the 24th, specifically so that we can receive a draft, which is standard procedure in the auditing business. I've insisted upon having a draft before we have the completed report, which will be presented to us on the second Thursday in December. But the November meeting has been scheduled for until Monday, the 24th of November.
Pete, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
About the Ron's work on the fixed asset list? Just help me understand, is there a module in Munis that allows us to track those fixed assets? And so is there some additional cost that we may be looking at in order to
No,
track this going forward?
we've always had that module. They did a fixed, when GASB 34 was implemented over about a dozen years ago, we had to put the depreciation in the GASB 34 section. American Appraisal came in here and did an inventory and loaded it into the Munis module. We've had that fixed asset module for a number of years. The inventory was somewhat flawed, but the hard part and where the management letter comment came was maintaining it. So actually, it's done by Roland manually at the end of each year. We don't properly maintain it, but the short answer is no, it's not going to cost us anything additional.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry, Mr. Finger?
Art, just want to clarify that the audit committee is Monday, the 23rd. 24th is a Tuesday.
Monday, the 23rd, yeah.
That's noted in the controller's report, in first paragraph.
Okay.
ADP, good news. We're in the process of transitioning from implementation mode and to the normal day-to-day support. I'll read a quote from Geneva consultant Becky McAvoy, who Nancy Weissler and Mary Lee are familiar with, who we were hired to help us get through this implementation. The interface with the general ledger is functioning properly with only a few small items not fully resolved due to the large part of the town and Board of Ed's change in needs. So I hope it's safe to say that the implementation is over with, and what we're doing is dealing with the biweekly to biweekly issues that are generated by the one-offs that are always going to happen with any system you put in. And then the 2 bullets that are listed in the controller's report, the additional training, and the biggest concern now will be the making sure that it's fully utilized. As far as I spoke to last month, we still have pockets where people are using timesheets and the system, which we want to get people off. Some of them are using them legitimately because they don't have access to time clocks. There's a myriad of reasons and answers. In some cases, they're not acceptable. So that's the biggest concern right now, is moving to the training and the full utilization of the system. And I'll entertain any questions before I move on to the next topic. Nancy?
I just wanted to add a couple of comments so everyone's aware. A report has been prepared on ADP and the status of it right now, so that is available. I think it basically addresses and summarizes where we stand related to the three major challenges, which are mainly behind us. One, there's accurate processing of payroll. Second, correct transmission of vendor files. And as Pete said, an accurate interface with the GL. And I think one metric that captures the payroll accuracy is the number of manual checks cut per month. If you look back a year ago, when it first went live, they were cutting 164 checks per month because of glitches and errors and everything. As of September, that was reduced to 18 checks. And as Pete mentioned, there are a number of challenges that still require additional training. Right now, about 12% of employees who could use the timestamp function aren't doing so. Some of that's clock-related, some of that's training-related or culture. Some managers are still doing manual edits to the system, and those should really only be done on an exception basis. And there are some additional features of the system that people aren't taking advantage of yet, which could further improve the efficiency and our results that we get out of the system. But I think kudos to finance, IT, HR, for everyone who's worked so hard in major accomplishment this past year.
So Nancy, does that mean Roland gets to have a lunch break now?
We have other plans for Roland.
Roland, you get it in public, Roland. Mr. Goldrick.
Peter, could you tell us how much we are paying Barry Dunn and Geneva Consulting for their work on this? And does the report also detail what went wrong over all of these months of the rollout?
Barry Dunn has been gone for a while. I can get you the figures from last year, but they haven't been on, we haven't been paying them for a few months now. I'll get you, you want the total cost?
Yeah, for them and Geneva, you've got them both cited here. I just wondered what the cost was.
Yeah. I think I also said that the consultant from Barry Dunn is no longer needed for this assignment. They're gone.
So was it pro bono for Barry Dunn, or he got paid, right? I'm just curious what.
No, I'll give you the total cost from when we hired him all the way through probably May or June.
And Geneva, do you have a ballpark figure for those two?
I don't know. You have Roland? No. I can't. They're easy to access, so we can get you the numbers. I just didn't expect that question. What was it? You had a second question. What was it?
I thought he also asked about Geneva Consulting.
Okay.
Yeah, the two of them.
I'm going to move on to a question that Nancy Weisler asked about the OPEB fund and the due to, due from. Actually, it's very relevant. We had an extended conversation last week at the BET Investment Advisory Committee and the OPEB Committee, and one of the issues was the due to, due from rose to $5.7 million at June 30th, and which my treasurer and myself considered high. It's very explainable, but I have to go back a number of years and explain how we got there. Going back to the days of Larry Simon and Bob Stone and, of course, Art Norton, when we had the BET Ad Hoc Committee and the OPEB was not a trust fund, it was a reserve fund. The BET Ad Hoc Committee, followed up by the OPEB trust members, came up with this concept that because the general fund pays the bills, and for the OPEB, the health care both for the actives and the OPEB, and that's also where that implicit rate subsidy comes in because of the rates where the older ones, retirees are getting the rate for the active. Because the general fund is restricted by state statute as to how much they can earn, and you could see that reflected in the Treasurer's report, which is coming up next, the concept came up that we would let the due to run out through the end of the year and leave the money, the OPEB monies, in the OPEB fund where they can invest in the stock market, for example. You can't, in the general fund, you can't invest in the stock market, commercial paper, et cetera. So that's been going on for many years. And where it caught the Treasurer's attention is when it ballooned up to $5.7 million. We had the ARC come due in July for $6,091,000, and the net number reflected in the controller's report was 3.5, and we were only able to draw the due to down to about $1.9 million, $2 million. The conversation was extended, and I'm speaking for Randy, Art, John Blankley, and Bill Drake, Joe Pellegrino, and Rob Stricker. It was concluded that we would leave it that way. What was not concluded was how high should we let it go. So the challenge we have is to decide at the level of the Investment Advisory Committee how high we want that to go. Now, that's a combination of trying to answer Nancy's question in the history of how we got there and why we do that. And I think offline I answered that. So for the members that don't attend, does everybody understand? It's been around for many, many years that we do that. And hopefully the BET accepts it and moves on, and we'll just address how much we want to get that up to.
I just have a follow-up question. If it's staying in OPEB, but is due to the general fund, any return it generates would go back if it basically accumulates as a receivable with the investment return associated with it?
It's immaterial at this point. We don't reimburse the funds, reciprocating as far as, because of the amounts are small, and we kind of offset. For example, the OPEB fund doesn't pay for the administrative charges that are done by the treasurer for all the work she does for the OPEB trust board.
Moving on.
I got two more.
Yes.
I was going to answer that, but somebody said something. One comment is we did hire somebody to spell Roland, so he's going to be able to take a lot more lunches. She starts November 2nd, and we wrote into, as we reported to the HR committee, one of the job description which changed slightly, and one of the duties is going to be working on the payroll biweekly and the issues that come up that Roland is currently doing. And then, of course, she's going to do what Maureen Tracy did before, who moved over to take Roy Carey's place, and is going to help us during the February budget deliberations, et cetera. Last issue is retirement board, and what I'm going to do is...
Mr. Chairman, before you go, could I go back a little bit to the OPEB? Because I think the point about OPEB should be made that it has a substantial unfunded liability. And one of the points that we made when we set it up this way is, even in addition to the due-tos, there's also the unfunded liability. And if we can grow the corpus to a point at which we absorb some of the unfunded liability, which also would reduce the ARC, which we have agreed to in the past, or at least in the current budget, to fund fully, and hopefully we'll do the same thing going forward. There are two things we have to consider. One is the unfunded liability, and secondly, the current differentiation, or the so-called due-tos that are incurred each and every year, which is the reason in which we're leaving the money in the OPEB fund so that it's potentially able to increase in value.
Okay. I'm going to read from you excerpts from the BET minutes, September 24, 2015. I think you're going to improve them later. The retirement board, through the law committee, the BET law committee, and the BET investment advisory committee, bought a $40 million investment, GAM unconstrained bond fund. It was approved 9-3, and in the minutes, it said, with documentation from the law department to follow. This was September 24th. It's a month later. I don't know the status of this fund. I can't tell you if this fund is a fixed income fund or an alternative investment. It's a month later. Next page. We brought the Loomis Sales Senior Loan Fund to the law committee and the IAC, and the Loomis Sales Strategic Alpha Fund. It was deferred a month ago, and the reason was it was lacking documentation. I can't tell you now if the documentation is still lacking. I can't tell you if the Strategic Alpha Fund is a fixed income or alternative investment. Why I bring that up is because we have a charter restriction, 208A, that tells us that we have to calculate, we can't violate the 25% rule, which you're all familiar with, because that amendment took almost a year to get through the RTM and the BET. This process is flawed at best. I'm not going to say it's broken, but what it's doing is we've gone from having retirement issues go through slowly to it's gotten to the point where confusion is coming up between the law department, the BET law committee, the BET IAC. I'm not saying individually, I'm saying collectively in the retirement board members. And it's creating tension, and the process has to be better. There has to be a better way of getting these retirement investments through the process. If you come to the retirement board meetings, the chairman's behind me, I can't tell you how many times we've complained over the years about the process. We use the word nimbleness. These 2-3 investments have been out there for months and months and months. To be honest with you, I can't even remember the presentations from last December, January, et cetera. So I reach out to you on behalf of the retirement board, Chairman Mason. We have to look at this process and make it a little bit better because it's awkward. It shouldn't take 3 months to get paperwork after we've spent 9 months to get paperwork for issues like this. And I'll open up to any questions on the retirement board or anything else on the controller's report, unless you have comments on the retirement issues.
So I think I've been given a directive. And I think we deserve it. I think I've watched this. I've heard all the concerns. I've heard of asking for material, waiting to see the contract, waiting for this copy, concerns about the investment, the whole gamut. I think you're right. I think it is time. What the solution to the issues, I don't know yet, but I certainly believe a starting point will be the Investment Advisory Committee, IAC as you call it, and the Law Committee need to have a checklist for these items when they come their way. Because it's sort of repetitive. We need the document, we need the contract, we need this, we need to see if it meets this standard. These are repetitive requests. We can do better on this, and I think we have to do this going forward. So your point is well taken.
Just one add-on, and Bill's going to say something. Loomis Sales Senior Loan Fund has, as of September 30th, $13.4 million. We've already invested. It's already approved. The Strategic Alpha Fund has already got $9.8 million invested. They've been there for months and months and months. It shouldn't be this hard to have an already approved investment be amended.
Right.
Just in my opinion.
Well, we saw the start of this in the last term. One of our members was flashing that, was saying, hey, look, that we've got to find a different way. And we do have a very quick alternative. We could do a single source contract like they did back with Russell, where we didn't have this, but the BET chose to make a change where we're approving all of these. The real question is, are we approving the contract and or the investment? Well, if the investment's in the contract, we sort of get tied up. But I agree with you, and I think this needs to really move to the top of the priority list. Mr. Drake?
For my part, I completely agree with what Mr. Minorski says. His points are spot on, and this process needs to improve. And it passes through the Investment Advisory Committee. My personal commitment is to make some recommendations to improve it, like everybody's suggestion, but it has to get better.
Mr. Raymer?
Yeah, then I think it's appropriate to speak in terms of the Law Committee. The Loomis Sales Strategic Alpha Fund is perhaps a somewhat more extreme example, but maybe I should single that one out and talk about what we've had with that, because I want people to understand that I think what has to happen here is not just a question of minor policy changes. I think there needs to be a more organic change than that. I think one needs to take a look at the requirements of Section 208 of our charter and decide if charter amendment isn't actually what's required. Talking specifically about the Loomis Sales Strategic Alpha Fund, though, so that you understand, so that all people understand. The fundamental checklist that the Law Committee looks for with each of these investments does not change. We're obliged under Section 208 as a BET to approve the contract documents. In the case of Loomis Sales Strategic Alpha Fund, the contract documents, although I expected they would have been simplistic, were not available to us in September. They were not available to us in October. You can't reasonably expect a law committee or a town attorney to approve a document that they have not yet seen. Secondly, we invariably require that there at least be in the file the recommendation of NEPC of the investment, either as a positive recommendation or at least a neutral recommendation. The recommendation of NEPC to increase that fund to $40 million from, I think, the 13 that we originally approved had not yet been received. We can't approve something when our advisor hasn't yet responded to whether or not what we're doing is advisable. We invariably require that we not be offering advice on the advisability of an investment which the retirement board itself has not yet voted on. In this particular case, the retirement board had voted on it. At the time of the September meeting, we did not have that piece of information. We invariably require that the Investment Advisory Committee had also acted on it. And in this particular case, the minutes that were given to us of the Investment Advisory Committee said that the two funds together were approved, quote, for the fixed sum of $40 million, whereas we were being told that what we're being asked to approve was $40 million apiece. And so we sought clarification of that. But most importantly, in this particular fund, we had the opinion given to us of the town attorney that, in fact, the investment did not comply with the requirements of the restricted 25% of Section 208 of the Charter, which is exactly the sector of the portfolio for which we were being told this investment was to be directed. And so under those circumstances, the Law Committee didn't disapprove this. We actually tried in a helpful way to reach out and say, we will opine, and we voted 2-0 to say that we will support the investment as being in legal order, but by the time we get to the meeting tonight, we want to have received the list of, and the list included each of the items that I just recited, some of which in the interim we did receive. For example, the contract document we've seen. We still have no opinion from NEPC as to the advisability. I did informally from Bill Drake be advised that the minutes of the Investment Advisory Committee are being amended to make it indelibly clear that that committee approved two $40 million investments, although I haven't seen that in writing. There's been no change whatsoever, most importantly, in the advice of the town attorney that this investment does not comply with the restrictions of the 25% of the restricted portfolio. I raise no insistence that you have a law committee or that the law committee pass on these. But as long as you have a Section 208 and as long as you're referring these things to the law committee, I can tell you the law committee's checklist is not going to change. And if the items on the checklist aren't before us, it becomes incredibly difficult for the law committee to approve these items as being in legal order. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just real quickly, I think you're supporting what I just said.
Yes.
You're frustrated. I'm frustrated. John's frustrated.
Right.
We're not blaming the law committee. We're blaming the process.
Nor did I think you are. I was hearing from some of my colleagues, however, that the flavor was that mere attitude or policy differences would take care of it. And I'm clearly of the view that it's not a question of attitude or policy or approach. We have an organic difficulty in Section 208 where we have fine people like Mr. Chadwick sitting there who bring us investment advice that requires a nimbleness to be able to respond to, and our responses have been anything but nimble, and it's an outgrowth of exactly what's written organically into our charter, and that needs to be changed.
Right. I think there's a very simple checklist process that has to be on all these items. It's really quite simple. Because the questions, as I said before, are pretty consistent. We're hearing the same feedback. So But I appreciate that. I think we're at that point where we need to start doing something on this.
I just remembered what I was supposed to respond to Sean about. I will send the report out to everybody from the consultant electronically, and I'll get you the Geneva cost, and I'll get you the Berry Dunn cost.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Goldrick.
let me offer a differing opinion on what's going on with our pension fund. I think the
Before
notion...
you get going, the conversation is on the process of handling investments that go through sort of, I'll call it the retirement board and our systems. It's not about the pension performance rate. It's about the conversation's about the process of how we can take an idea that the retirement board has or a concept or an investment and work it through the process and not have it take incredible amounts of time. And I think I heard the word nimble, and I think we're far from that. So I think that's what the conversation's about.
Well, as I was beginning to say, I take issue with that point of view. I would suggest that if we still have a fund which has been purchased by the retirement board, we still don't know, there's no final decision on whether that fund goes into fixed income or equities, whether it violates that particular part of the charter, is ludicrous. If you have a question as to, no, excuse me, I have the floor, Mr. Chairman.
Hang on.
I have a letter from our attorney telling exactly what it is.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I have the floor, I believe.
Okay, you need to be I'm going to give you notice now. You need to be very careful in your choice of words on the action of people who are the caretakers of this money.
Yeah, and I'm an elected official who is also responsible for taking care of the taxpayers' money. And in that regard, I will continue.
I'm sorry, hold on. From here on in, before you lose your right to the floor, on this particular case, they're responsible for taking care of the beneficiary's money. I just want you to be correct in your term. This is the beneficiary's money. The pension money belongs to the beneficiaries of the pension. That's who owns that money. So I just think you need to be accurate.
Let me just point out, to be accurate, the taxpayers of this town for the last year just coughed up $22 million into this fund. And every year now, they're due to put in over $20 million. So this circles back to the taxpayers of this town. It's one of the largest expenses that we have in the town budget. Now, I would also point out, in terms of process, this is the one entity in the town of Greenwich which has oversight responsibility over the investments of the pension fund. It's there in the town charter. The wording has become a little bit archaic, but it's there. And it is up to us to exercise that oversight responsibility. So I have voted against a number of these investments, and as I was saying, if there is a doubt about whether a fund should go in one category or the other, you don't buy it. And there's no investment professional in Greenwich who would disagree with that. Now, in terms of process, I would point out that it's not the nimbleness, as you put it, of this board which is the problem, because by the retirement board's own report sent to the investment advisory committee, they point out that over half of their investments are no longer in the portfolio because of poor performance. That's a hit rate of under 50%. I would also point out, Mr. Chairman, that the white paper on the problems of the pension fund that Mr. Huffman and I submitted, and which you directed to the Investment Advisory Committee, still hasn't been taken up by that committee for consideration. It's not nimbleness. It's not this board that's the problem. It's the retirement board itself.
I'd make a motion to approve the controller's report.
So, all those in favor?
Aye.
Next,
Treasurer's report, move to accept.
I have a motion moved and second for the treasurer's report. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Okay, back to the. Let me just clear this paper. Okay. That brings us to item 6, standing committee reports. I had nothing. Liaison reports. Item 8, special project team reports. Labor contracts. Ms. Kiernan, you first, me? Your choice.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, we just completed through the summer negotiations with the GOSA union. Just by way of context, this is a union of 55 employees who are the administrators in the public schools throughout the town, but does not include the cabinet members at the Board of Education, such as the superintendent and his top staff. And so we took part in 6 negotiations during the summer and then 3 mediation sessions, one of which finished right before the arbitration deadline. The tentative agreement has been approved by both the union and the Board of Education and goes before the RTM next Monday evening. The Labor Contracts Committee approved the item, and the Education and Finance Committees of the RTM are taking it up tonight. The total cost of the contract, wages and benefits together, is about $9.2 million for the first year, which is only a 1.78% increase over the prior year, or about $161,000. So that has 2 large components. The first is the GWI, which is increasing 2.6% in year 1 and will increase by the same amount same percentage in years 2 and 3. The second major part is healthcare, for a total cost of $1.06 million, which is a 16% reduction in healthcare costs over the prior year. Not a deceleration, but a reduction. But just by way of explanation, the healthcare agreement is very new to the town. In June, the Connecticut General Assembly passed a law which enabled municipal unions to join the state employee health insurance plan, known as the Connecticut Partnership Plan. There are about 43,000 employees right now in that plan, and the GOSA union will apply to be covered. And the carrier behind that plan is United Healthcare. So the premiums for that plan are expected to go up by only 6% in year 1, and that compares with the town's new healthcare contract, which we project to increase by 14.4% starting in January. So this is giving us a savings of about $200,000 for this particular union in year 1, and there was also negotiation around mitigating risk of rising premiums in years 2 and 3. The union will continue to share the cost of premiums. They pay for 12%, and the town pays for 88% of the premium. And it should be noted that Alcava has calculated that if all the unions in this community went into the state plan, potentially we could save about $15 million. One last footnote I would add, one negotiated point was the Cadillac tax, and we agreed that we would reopen the contract for that if, in fact, there's a major impact in 2018 from the Cadillac tax. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I would just like to add, Ms. Kiernan and I worked on that along with Board of Ed members Peter Scheer, Jennifer Dayton, and Peter Bernstein. And the administrators had hired a consultant that came in and gave us a presentation on the new state healthcare. During this process, Alcava and their consultant actually went to Hartford to verify some of the rates. This is a big change. It's new. It has some risk, but the coverages were measured, and I think going across the town, I think this will be the big talk of the town going forward. As you can see, the contract, the overall goal, I don't want to speak for the rest of the BET. Obviously, we know what we look for in operational guidelines as a rule. This met that. The administrators were happy with the health care. I mean, I would say they had to convince us about this program. I wish everybody was there to hear the benefits of it, but I think it's a worthwhile, and I think it will be the talk. I can honestly say that, Alcava's walked out of this and obviously probably reaching out and touching with all the bargaining units, giving them an update on this. So it was pretty interesting. We did have some very late nights. We had one night that was an early morning in mediation on this, which we always seem to get one of those. But overall, the RTM Finance Committee is working on that tonight, and the RTM has it Finance and Education are working on it tonight, and it goes before the RTM next Monday. So, again, thank you very much. Questions? Mr. Harkington? Okay. Next, New Lebanon School Building Committee, Mr. Drake.
I think we're going to build a superb school with this committee and on the site. The architect, Thai Soo Kim Partners, has been chosen. They've done many schools in Connecticut. The project, as you know, is to expand the capacity from 264 students to 374. To do that, you need 58,000 square feet of school, which is 20,000 more square feet than the school you have today. The preliminary budget figures for the project are $35 to $41 million, and this will be the largest capital project in the budget that's coming before us soon. As presently estimated, this project would be the third largest capital project in town history. You all remember you have an overall capital plan for this upcoming budget of $92 million, also the largest ever. So there's more information in the report, which was in your package. I won't repeat all that. And in early November, the architect is going to present alternative design options to the building committee, all in keeping with the approved ed spec and the chosen site. Let me talk for a minute about the process. The Board of Ed, when the time comes, is going to choose among different alternatives for the educational programming that's to take place there, naturally. And the building committee will make choices of architectural elements and physical features. And in a similar manner to those two bodies making the decisions that fall within their domain, this body should choose carefully among budget alternatives. There's a motion coming later in this meeting that was previously shared with you. The report that I sent includes that motion and was sent to every member of this board a week ago today. So everybody's had it for at least a week. And here we have this. So I'm going to make a motion to add this item to the agenda if it's needed. Frankly, the report was in everybody's hands a week ago. The motion is part of the report. The report is checked here on this agenda. So if Robert's Rules has procedures to design that no one can put a surprise motion before the board, certainly that isn't the alternative. That isn't what's going on here. You all saw this a week ago. It hasn't changed a word. So if that's an oversight of mine, not to put both the report and the motion separately on the agenda, when I just put the report, which included the motion, then I apologize. Mea culpa. I just apologize in Latin. Does that help? So, but I would ask that the committee, that the board consent to add this item to the agenda. It's an important item for the community, and I think the board deserves the opportunity to face it.
So you have a request to add the following motion to the agenda for this evening.
Yes, and I'll read it. It's no different than what was emailed to everybody 12 days ago and what's in your BET package, but I'll read it. Whereas the BET has statutory responsibility for the proper administration of the financial affairs of the town under Charter Article 1, Section 1, and shall prescribe the form of proposed budgets under Charter Article 2, Section 21C, resolved that several different alternative budgets for the New Lebanon School project, which meet the program of space requirements of the education specification, shall be proposed for BET consideration to include at least two alternatives: complete demolition of the existing school and a substantial renovation of the existing school combined with a building addition. So my motion is a motion to add the discussion of that to today's.
Okay.
I'll second the motion.
So, okay, we have a motion to add an item to the agenda. You've heard the motion. Discussion on the motion to add.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Raymer.
To the best of my knowledge, I didn't bring my Robert's Rules with me, but I don't think a motion to add an item to the agenda is a debatable motion.
Correct.
I think it requires a vote.
Correct. The vote would have to pass by 2/3.
Yes, it requires a two-thirds vote.
It'll need 2/3. So the motion is to add an item to the agenda. That needs to pass by 2/3. If it passes by 2/3, we will have discussion on the motion, followed by a vote on it. If it fails to pass by 2/3, then the item is done. Okay, so when you vote in favor of if you vote in favor of adding the item, you're voting to continue the discussion. If you vote against it, you're voting to discontinue the discussion.
Point of
Clear?
information.
Yes.
Does the chairman have a second vote in this circumstance?
Only to break a tie.
That's material. You need 2/3.
This is 2/3, though. This has nothing to do with that. Right. All right.
So, yeah.
So if I may, all those in favor of adding an item to the agenda, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. So that item has carried, oh boy, I got 4 negative and 8 positive. That does carry.
And it was Ms. Kiernan, just, they got it right.
Baker, Raymer, Kiernan, and Blankley.
Yep, okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's passed.
Okay. That is 2/3. Okay, so with that said, so that does bring the motion up for discussion. Mr. Drake.
You know, examining alternative budgets is our long-established routine. You know, shall we settle some legal case for the sum of X or Y? Or shall we build the Byron Park project for $9 million or $11 million? It's routine common sense of decision-making. This motion just preserves that fundamental process of governance, and it extends beyond New Lebanon School. You know, for us to carry out our responsibilities, we make practical choices among alternatives. You know, there are many involved, committed participants here, and experts trying to do something excellent. You know, the Board of Ed is trying to do something excellent here. The Building Committee is trying to do something excellent. The selectmen are trying to build a great school, and the community wants this done. While all those participants are going to make choices in their domains, the financing of the project, in the absence of this motion, will get submitted to the BET really without choices. It becomes an up or down vote under circumstances when down is not a vote that you can take. So I don't think that's anyone's intent. I don't think that's the Board of Ed's intent, or I don't know. I don't think it's the selectmen's intent. It's certainly not the intent of those that designed our government and instituted the responsibility for the financial affairs of the town in this body's domain. But it could be the accidental outcome of this process if we don't approve this motion. So this is not a controversial thing. It's just a question of governance and decision-making choices among alternatives, which is the only way to make choices. And we at the BET have a duty we can't escape of weighing and choosing. And so I'd ask that we pass this and do our duty. I ask for your support, and we're going to build a superb school.
Mr. Johnson, followed by Mr. Raymer.
Why not? Why not get a couple alternatives to look at? I mean, we've seen with the Byron Pool project, so far it's been fairly constructive to listen to some options. We're going to hopefully get some other options as we hear back from them in January with some hard estimates and bids. Frankly, I wasn't on the BET when this happened, but I wish we'd gone through this with MISA, looking at a couple serious alternatives. Seems like we were handed one set of ed specs, one design plan, and vote yes or no. And I think we could have saved a lot of heartache, a lot of time with us debating later on in the budgeting process when they're over budget. So, you know, I support this motion. I think it's a great idea to get at least 2 alternative plans. We have what appears to be a very good architect. It appears from reading the newspapers, unfortunately, they have a number of different options, and they're going to flush them out. I kind of get a kick out of what's been written in the newspaper by reporters or columnists that are talking all about the pluses and minuses of the plans when nobody's even seen the plans yet. It's all rumor. So until they come and present them, let's have an open mind as to what we're going to see. So I fully support this.
Mr. Raymer.
I don't support the motion for at least a couple of reasons, and one of those reasons has two more things that sit behind it. Let me talk about this for a moment. First of all, this is in the nature of a sense of the meeting resolution. There's certainly nothing in Robert's Rules of Order that prevents a body from having sense of the meeting resolutions, and we certainly have had the experience that the RTM does sense of the meeting resolutions all the time. But to my recollection, I've been on this board for a while, but not as long as some others have been, I've never known this board to do sense of the meeting resolutions. Secondly, we've gone through a process that was astonishingly long-winded under the circumstances. When I say the we, I mean the town, of a long process of approving municipal improvements, so-called MI, that went through several iterations, and in the end, MI was launched by the Board of Selectmen and approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission based upon a very specific plan. And what you're asking here is that the building committee begin to put together price points of something that is actually a plan at variance from what was referred to them by the MI process, the Board of Selectmen, and the Planning and Zoning Commission. So in the process of this, I feel like, first of all, we're poaching on what has already been the executed responsibility of the Board of Selectmen on MI, what has already been the executed responsibility by Planning and Zoning, and we're further poaching on what is the province of decision-making by the Building Committee. And I'm disinclined to do that. I think we should pay attention to our business being to act upon requests for appropriation that come before us, none of which has happened tonight. There's no appropriation before us. What we want to be doing, what we're being asked to do here, is to begin to offer opinions about how others should be doing their work and what we think is wrong with the actions of the Board of Selectmen and the Planning and Zoning Commission on work that they've already done. Underlying that, for me, is two further things, and that is that I was present as a member of the feasibility committee, and I remember the architect in that particular instance, a gentleman by the name of Mike Tribe, early in the process was asked about the advisability of exactly the price alternatives that are underlying the suggestion being made here. I'm sorry that Mike Tribe isn't here to respond, but I remember his response to our feasibility committee, and that was for him to observe aloud to us that, in his opinion, the existing building there was a seriously inferior building, with the result of which that it would add considerably to the cost of renovation. It would produce a product that is nowhere near as good as the product that you would have gotten had you built anew. And in the most serious way, it would produce something that was energy inefficient. And as I recall, the figure that he said, that he thought there would be an energy deficiency to the tune of about $40,000 a year of energy loss between the alternatives. The remaining thing that's worth mentioning to you is not something that came up from the conversation with Michael Tribe, but that was offered by others later on, and that is that the reimbursement formulas to us on a renovation of a building are not as attractive as the reimbursement arrangements that are available to us under the diversity resolution process, the so-called 80% subsidy. It doesn't really work out to be an 80% subsidy, but it probably does work out to be a 65% subsidy. Don't take me too literally on those figures. And so I think in the end, you're not going to see the price advantages that you were thinking of with these resolutions. But my serious issue right now is the fact of I don't wish to start a process of our doing sense of the meeting resolutions, and I don't think it should be the business of this body to tell the Board of Selectmen what they should have done, to tell Planning and Zoning what they should have done, and to tell the Building Committee what they should be doing. These people should be allowed to do their work. We should do our work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Finger?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I echo the comments of Mr. Raymer. What I'd like to also add here is it was indicated that the intent is for us to examine budgets. There is no budget before us. The charter is clear that it's the first selectman's responsibility to present a budget to us. And with regard to budget reviews, we have a process. February 1st next year, the First Selectman and the Board of Ed will present their operating budgets. First Selectman will present the capital budget. Then those budgets get reviewed by the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee may choose to make modifications to the budgets, both capital and operating. Those budgets then are presented to the full BET for review and vote, up or down modifications That's exactly the process that we followed for the Byram Park Pool project. I think we are getting way out of line here as a body to try to dictate to a building committee, to a first selectman, that we want certain budgets. This is way too premature. There is no budget, and we should be waiting until the building committee does their work and presents a budget that they propose, or a project that they propose with a budget attached to it that meets the ed specs that were presented by the Board of Education. This sets a really, really bad precedent. I mean, if we approve a motion like this, where does it stop? Are we going to go to DPW and tell them the types of budgets we want for road improvements, for sewer improvements, for everything? I mean, this is the finance board. Information comes to us, we decide as a board how we're going to finance those projects. This is, in my opinion, this is way out of line, and I just think the way it's gotten in front of us is poor form. You know, sorry, Bill, but the building report was not a building report. I mean, I look back at what Leslie Tarkington and Art used to present as representatives of building committees when they were Project Renew at Nathaniel Witherell. I think, Art, you were at Glenville also, and Leslie at Mesa. It was a very objective report. This is not objective. This is an opinion with numbers that are, I mean, I don't think a building committee even now could tell us what the budget numbers are, because they don't even have a plan yet. So this would be a very, very bad day for the BET if we pass a motion that's proposed, this motion that's proposed in front of us.
Mr. Norton, followed by Ms. Kiernan.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take issue with the concept of a sense of the meeting resolution, because I do not at all believe there's a sense of the meeting resolution. First off, the BET is a policy-making body and has specific responsibility. And one of the responsibilities is set financial policy. And policy-making bodies do not propose and make sense of the meeting resolutions because they either affect or compromise their responsibility as a policy-making body. And in this instance, what we are talking about is setting the policy for what we will fund to provide a capital project at some time in the future.
Mr. Chairman, first, I concur with my colleagues that this is just simply out of order this evening. There is no application in front of the BET from the Board of Education or the New Lib Building Committee, and there's no reason for this resolution at all. It sets up a classic false choice in my mind, a binary decision between two options, and neither of which are in front of us this evening, and neither of which we have jurisdiction over this evening. So I think I will be abstaining from this motion because I don't think it's properly in front of us. Let me emphasize also that what if this is passed? Let's just pull on that a little bit. Nothing will happen. This resolution is not binding. We can't bind ourselves to a future vote on anything. And it certainly won't bind the Board of Ed or the Building Committee on anything that they are doing. So this resolution does, in fact, resemble a sense of the meeting resolution because it has no effect. And that is not the practice of this board. It has never been. And we risk constant posturing about matters that are not in front of us if we start to go down this path. Now, there is certainly nothing wrong with obtaining more information about the choices in front of the Building Committee, and I don't think any of us would quarrel with Bill Drake's intention in that regard. But I would suggest that Mr. Drake go back to the Building Committee and ask for that analysis where he is a member. And I see we have the Building Committee Chairman with us this evening. More information should be good information in my view, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to set up a required alternative, that should have happened last March when we set that up for the Byram Pool process. And that didn't happen. I want to remind everybody it was a 12-0-0 vote to appropriate $2.85 million for A&E, and there was no alternative set up at that time, and there's none in front of us tonight. Now, again, if we come to March, Mr. Drake, and you're still unhappy, then I think the time to express that will be in March, and you should vote no on that project. And I understand that would be a difficult choice, but you must respect the process we have in front of us, the really decentralized process we have around building education buildings, and I think respect all of the responsibilities that we each have as we liaise with these various projects. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from our own policies and procedures manual, just to go to Bill Finger's point. On page 28, liaisons shall be responsible for following activities and actions taken of the underlying body, board, department, commission, or agency for which they're responsible, and be prepared to report on such activities to the BET. Page 25, regarding the reports of committees, which are similar to liaisons. Written and oral reports shall be submitted to the BET by the committee chairman with suitable noting of contrary views. Opportunity for submission of minority reports shall be made available by the BET chairman. And we're going to see that tonight with the guidelines. We need to be objective in our reporting out from these committees and then share our own opinions when the time is presented to us for discussion on a motion, and certainly not within the written reports that are published online for the entire community to see and possibly be misled by. I will say there are certain statements, Bill, I'm sure well-intended, in your report that talks about how we finance this project that I think are simply incorrect. And I hope that Mr. Minarski, either tonight or another time, will clarify all of that for us. So again, I think this is inappropriate, and I will be abstaining from this vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Goldrick.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, first, when we're discussing process, I voted to put this on the agenda because I think that any proposal by a member should be permitted to get airing before this board. Mr. Drake is not trying to pull a fast one at the last minute on this. He's been discussing it for at least several days. I'm not sure why it had to go to a 2/3 vote, but I think whatever the merits of this particular proposal, he should have a right, and every member should have a right to bring this up. And I would just go back 2 years when we made a proposal to make it easier for minority members of the BET to put things on the agenda. It's kind of funny that the shoe is on the other foot here, but I'm happy to allow Mr. Drake to bring it up. To Ms. Kiernan's point, I don't think this is really a matter of abusing the liaison process. Mr. Drake made a proposal. It just happens to be listed there. He made a separate proposal, and that's what we're discussing right now. Furthermore, when we're talking about this is unprecedented, and we can't tell the building committee what to do. We tell the Board of Ed what to do all the time. We just did it. We just told them what to do with their school lunch program. We told the libraries what to do in terms of financing. So this board has a very flexible view of where it can get involved and not. I would just say that in terms of process, I think the way we build things in this town needs some serious reforms. We just coughed up how much? $1.2 million in a legal settlement with, was it Worth Construction for Hamilton Avenue School? And that's not counting the cost overruns. So I think we are getting a lot of input. We probably could do this a little better going forward. I'd just like to ask, Mr. Chairman, if you would like any members of the Board of Ed or Building Committee here this evening to make comments, because we do ask people who are involved with particular proposals or committees to comment, but it's up to you.
Your suggestion is well taken. I want to get to our board members first. Ms. Weisler?
Actually wanted to echo what Mr. Goldrick just said. Since Mr. Wacko is here, I was hoping he might be able to address a few questions that some of us might have on this if it were to be passed. Is that appropriate to raise those questions now?
If we had direct questions from Mr. Wacko, I would definitely do that. I just want to give everybody a chance to
Okay.
speak if they want first. Mr. Blankley?
Well, Mr. Chairman, the board has heard me on this subject before of what the BT should be doing. I have to say that I struggle just a little bit on this one because of the eloquence of Mr. Drake's support of his case. But I believe, as all board members know, I have a particular objection to what I regard as BT overreach. The idea in my mind is that we should be seeking to find ways to finance what comes before us. We should not be seeking to say what should be done. Now, it's a very fine line between those two, and I recognize that, and that's why I struggle in this particular case. I'm not going to enter into the argument about whether this is appropriate in terms of sense of the meeting resolution or what have you. I would disagree with my colleague, Mr. Goldrick, when it comes to what we said with regard to the school lunch fund. We did not direct the Board of Ed in that particular regard. We took what came from them. I was a liaison on that particular committee, and it seems to me that you told us what you wanted, and it seemed to me that we said, okay, these seem like reasonable proposals, and we accept that, or at least I accepted it. So, as I say, it's a fine line between what we finance and what we say we should be financing. And in this particular case, I have to say I come down on the side of saying this particular motion is inappropriate, and I concur with the view of Mr. Raymer, Mr. Finger, and Ms. Kiernan.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes. I would just like to comment here that I'm disappointed that Bill Drake feels that as a BET member and one who is representing all 12 of us on this building committee, that he feels such a resolution is necessary, and that the building committee won't accept his recommendations to consider alternatives, because for each and every project that we do, we all should be considering what are the best alternatives for the town. I vary a little bit from Ms. Kiernan in terms of what we did in March, because she's brought up the Byram Pool. But quite frankly, I think we can look, directly at the New Lebanon Building Committee itself, and New Lebanon appropriation. And, quite frankly, in my opinion, it was very detailed. Ms. Kiernan and I worked together on it. And quite frankly, if this was an important point, and quite frankly, I think it is an important point, it should have been included in the conditions, which gave guidance in the early steps, including the architectural drawings. So again, we approve that without this direction. And, both Mr. Drake and Mr. Raymer, as he pointed out just a few minutes ago, had the experience of being on that feasibility study and could have provided this guidance. Further, if we're going to, proceed with this motion, I'd like to add an amendment to it, and at an appropriate time, to basically, to consider, if we're going to consider alternatives, a partially manufactured construction building or components, so that, if we're going to look at alternatives, that we look at all alternatives. So, anyway.
Mr. Walco, I always knew the day would come where you'd be on the other side of this kiosk. So, we're in a wrestling match, and believe it or not, most of the BET agrees we have a process. Most of the BET wants the best project. Where this starts out is, in the initial stages of this project, the original consultant had sort of told the Board of Ed, there's a couple roads you can go here, a couple different alternatives, there'll be a price difference, there might be some beneficial areas if you do one type of project versus another with the displacement of the children. I think we all share that concern. I didn't hear much mentioned on that. The challenge for the BET, and as you chaired this board during the Ham Ave, Glenville, some of the other projects, is what I think the BET is concerned with is that we get to the point where it'll be you asking for a release of money. And the question comes back, hey, would we ever decide with that alternative about a partial remediation, a partial demolition, and a partial new wing. You know, we're adding 20,000 feet, so obviously the footprint issue is out the window. We're going to have a much bigger footprint. And I think the BET's concern, and we saw this with other capital projects, no names mentioned, where a project was kept escalating in cost, and we kept getting ourselves in a position where, you know, do we want to ask for an ed spec change? Do we want to get rid of a certain feature? Do we want to do something as the price was escalating? So I think what my question to you is, and I think Mr. Raymer said it, and Mr. Finger certainly said it, there is that process, there is informal conversations, there is communications, but instead of the BET getting to a position where you're standing in front of us for X amount of $1 million, and we're sitting here saying, did you think of that alternative? And the answer is no, we chose to do that. Is there a way that we can have that balance to where our concerns are worked on along the way? So when you are standing in front of us for a release of conditions, we're sitting there saying, yep, we answered that question, we answered this, we had that. That's, I think, what the wrestling is here. We don't want to get to the point where I heard Ms. Kiernan say, well, Mr. Drake, in March you can vote no. I look at the Board of Ed members, we don't want that to happen. We don't want to get to May or March or wherever you're asking for money, and then we say no. I think the idea is to try to move those questions and concerns to now and avoid that then. If I'm not phrasing it right, I'm just trying to give you sort of the conception, what I'm hearing here, because I do hear a lot of agreement. I think everybody's trying to do the right thing here.
Good evening.
Good evening, Steve.
It's good to see a bunch of familiar faces. Let me try to answer a few questions and also just clear up maybe some misconceptions. First, Mr. Raymer, MI approval has not been granted, just so it's perfectly clear here. There has only been an application for MI. In fact, because of the process, it will be the building committee's architect that actually carries the MI process across the finish line. And so that's why it's so important that we, in fact, hire a very good architect and then use those plans, and those plans will form the basis of MI. So even though it's not a building committee MI, it's a Board of Selectmen application, they will be using the plans drawn up by the New Lebanon Building Committee's architect to do that. In terms of Ms. Tarkington's viewpoint on looking at all projects, I will say as a general nature and as a general framework to the architect and then to the CM, and I'll talk about that in a second too, we have taken on the philosophy that more information is beneficial to not only us, but also the taxpayers and boards and commissions like you all. So for instance, in terms of constructability, we have consistently told both in the architect review process, and I suspect that will carry forward, tell us about whether or not we can use off-site construction and whether or not there's a savings there, both financially, time-wise. We have taken nothing off the table. We have not taken anything off the table because, in fact, we know that there are going to be questions like that, and we need to respond accordingly. So in my mind, we need to ask those questions up front. We need to keep an open mind about not only the questions but the answers, then be able to come back to you and say, yes, we can do that, or no, we can't, and here's why we decided not to do that. Anything short of that, to me, is the committee not doing its job and responding to you. Similarly, with respect to renovation versus new construction, the ed specs are crystal clear. They use the term new building. What is unclear, especially to someone like me, is what's a new building. I think everybody in this room would consider Glenville School a new building. Glenville School used the same auditorium. Glenville School used the same footprint for the most part. Glenville School effectively used the same ceiling. Okay? That is a new school. That is very different, though, from saying that we renovated Glenville. Because in my mind, we didn't renovate Glenville. So in our discussions with the architect, we have said, also show us what elements of the old school could be used, why would you use them, and why would it benefit the taxpayers? Why would it benefit the community? So if there's a retaining wall that's there, I don't think there's anybody here that would say if the retaining wall works and that's where it should be placed, we should just destroy the retaining wall and build a new one. That's very different from saying, in my mind, okay, there's the entire main portion of the thing and stick another school on top of the existing new lab. All of this goes to The more information we can get up front to make sure you all make an informed decision, the RTM makes an informed decision, and the ultimate benefit is to the taxpayer, to the community, to the Byram community, but also to the Greenwich community. Because if we are going to build a school that is truly a magnet school, we need to build a school that not only attracts people from Byram and helps that community, but attracts people from other areas as well. And the only way we can do that is if we give you the information. And so even with our options, there's been a lot of press recently about potential options for New Leb. At least as far as I'm concerned, and I think this is where the committee is as well, is not to unravel what the feasibility study did, but to take that information and to take that framework and to provide for us, but so that we can intelligently talk to you about why the building is the way that it is designed. Without those options, we're making decisions in a vacuum. And so we're trying to keep an open mind. Those plans are due the 11th. The goal right now is to vote on them on the 18th, to move forward to give you all information. And this is aggressive, and so I want to lay that out right now, but I really hope to be able to get to all of you by February a pretty good idea on the pricing on this. We have already begun to talk about construction manager contracts, and we have given serious consideration to construction manager at-risk contracts. And we have given serious consideration to getting pre-construction services so that when we come to you with our estimate, that estimate is as tight as possible so that by the time these numbers hit the RTM in May, you have a reasonable assurance that that's the number that we're going to hit. And we have a reasonable assurance that that's the number we're going to hit. And that's my expectation, and I hope you share that expectation with me.
So, Steve, if I can, let's just say, I mean, the Bill's got two alternatives he's thinking about. You know, one is a completely new school, one is renovating part of the existing, somewhat of the structure and another addition. Do you think it's, if those both were kind of proceeding from the architect, and it looked like roughly, after all the reimbursements and all that, the prices were about the same, or there's some differences, is it reasonable to think that you could still show us those two plans and what their estimated costs are? Or are you hoping by that time just to come up with one plan and present that?
My understanding of the process is as follows. A lot of conversation has gone around site, but there's a lot that goes into the building, at the ed specs, not just the site of a building. By charter, we have to effectively follow those ed specs. I believe we're doing that. I believe that in any, the sort of standard protocol is to get various options to then come forward and make a decision on those options. My understanding is also that the New Leb Building Committee will make a recommendation, and then that recommendation is then shared with and presented to the Board of Education. Because this system is a little different from or this process has been a little bit different in that historically MI approval has been granted before the Building Committee is constituted. It's a little bit upside down, if you will.
Or maybe right side up.
Or right side up, correct. So I think there's a little bit of ability for greater interaction. And as I've said before, there's really nothing that we should be doing in a vacuum. I know most of the debate has revolved around the exact site, but no matter how strict adherence to that site the options are, I intend to bring it both back before the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen. To the extent that you want to, I mean, certainly the meetings are public. To the extent you want to see the options, you can, but I think there's a heavy presumption based on the ed specs that the building is built, that it's a new building, and the location of the building is where the ed specs say it should be. So any deviation from that, I think, requires additional approval.
Ms. Kiernan?
Steve, thank you for being with us this evening and sharing a lot of your thoughts. Let me make sure I understand. So you're saying the building committee is going to be working on a comparison of partial renovation, let's call it, and new, and bringing that to the Board of Ed at some point in time when you finish your plans, or no?
I didn't say that.
Okay, so will there be any kind of analysis, which I think Mr. Drake is looking for, that compares at least a partial renovation with a more closer to 100% new building?
I don't know because I haven't seen the options. I know I was questioned about a week and a half ago by a local newspaper reporter on that topic. The options, while they have been discussed in general form, we have not seen those options. The architect jokingly said at our last committee meeting, which was last Wednesday, he jokingly said, I've never seen a process where I want to do more work and I'm being told not to do it, and at no additional cost, because our price with him is a fixed price contract. My understanding is that we're going to get at least 2 options, and I think it's it's closer to 3 or 4 options. 4 might be a stretch, and it's to make sure that we adhere. It's to look at their creativity. If they present an option that renovates New Leb School, let me say it this way, I think it would get serious discussion about that, because they haven't been given that directive. And just to be clear here, Tai-Soo Kim has been given the directive of the ed specs.
Right.
They have not been encouraged to do anything but present plans consistent with the ed specs.
So help me square that, though, with the ed specs voted on the Board of Ed, which did call for a new building. So are you suggesting that if the architects present a renovation plan that the building committee then approves, you're going to go back to the Board of Ed and say, we would like you to approve a renovation plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could follow the what-ifs. I mean, that would be akin, in my mind, to suggesting that the Tai-Soo Kim is going to come back with putting the school on the field.
Well, we're talking about 2 different things here. When you say options, are we talking about the locations which have been referred to as schemes, or are you talking about renovation versus new in any of the locations?
I think I look at the ed specs in their totality, so I don't necessarily see the difference between those 2 issues. Mm-hmm. I see the ed specs calling for a new Lebanon school. Mm-hmm. Okay. Again, I think the gray area happens, what do you consider to be a new school?
Sure.
Right? If in fact Tai-Soo Kim came forward with a purely renovated new leb, let's just say all they did was plop a second story on it. Mm-hmm. My general sense is it wouldn't make it out of the committee. But I don't have a crystal ball, and I haven't seen that option. And that's why I'm referencing it to the same type of analysis that would go forward as if they came forward with building the school on the field.
Okay, and then just to clarify on MI, what came out of the Board of Selectmen is MI referral. And then it goes to Planning and Zoning for MI approval.
That's correct.
And it's really not in the ordinance, but it's a convention that we have instituted in town and call a referral, because if you don't get that first from the Board of Selectmen, it's just not going to be in the budget. So that's always the first stop. So I don't think it's unusual or upside down, frankly, that we've done it that way. It's just that we've taken a number of trips to the Board of Selectmen to achieve MI referral.
And my comment was on the timing, the difference between building committee being constituted and MI approval.
Mr. Raymer?
Let me not put words in your mouth, but let me just, so you spoke to us about the concept that there can be shades of gray between the renovation of existing structures and building wholly new. That the reality will be, if I'm, again, not putting words in your mouth, you'll be coming back to us, you'll probably be discussing options that were considered, some that were adopted, some that were rejected. But the options may not be strictly an entirely new structure in every single respect, and it also may not be, or likely wouldn't be, a renovation of an existing school. Is that a fair thing to say, or am I exceeding what you have said?
So break down what I said. No, it was a sort of a compound
Okay, it was.
analysis. So let me
Let me do it differently. A motion has been put before us that requests that your body come back with two alternatives, their expression. And the words of the motion are option one, complete demolition of the existing school, which might happen, I gather, from what you're saying, but it might be that there may be elements which are preserved. So complete demolition might, in fact, not be one of the options that you're bringing back. The other option, the other alternative, to stay with the words of the motion before us, is a substantial renovation of the existing school combined with a building addition. And I think you're saying to me that that doesn't fall within the ed specs as you see it. There's no request of the architect being made to come forward with I'm repeating it again, a substantial renovation of the existing school with a building addition. Or do I misunderstand you?
No, I think that's correct. We have not instructed the building committee, the architect, to present us with options that are outside the scope of the ed specs.
Which, what I read to you would be outside the scope of the ed specs. The substantial renovation of the existing school combined with a building addition.
Yeah, I think that would be, if I were to look at the plain language or the plain meaning of the words used in the ed specs, that's probably right.
Okay. So we're going to be hearing from you a review of options considered, lots of opportunity for discussion, but the discussion is not going to be as framed in this motion before us right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just to be clear on the discussion points, I mean, as far as I understand the process, and by the way, there is no handbook for building committees. To Mr. Goldrick's point, I would agree with you now this is the first one that I'm chairing in terms of how we can look at things. I've certainly reviewed I'm going to say, Mr. Norton, I know it's not his committee, but I think it's the audit committee that had lessons learned from Ham Ave, having lived through Ham Ave, having seen Glenville a little bit, and a little bit with Nathaniel Witherell. I think we can go in a direction where we should try to simplify it for the volunteers that step up to the plate, that run building committees and spend tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money trying to build buildings. But as I understand the process, we will be presented options by the Tai-Soo Kim on the 11th. We will recommend an option, one set of plans that then goes to the Board of Ed. It's my intention to then also relay that information to the Board of Selectmen, because technically it's their referral, and they will be using our plans for their referral. But other than that, I don't know, other than coming before you for money, that those options were going to be shared with the BET. Maybe I just didn't think about it, but I never saw in the process where that would happen, other than I know I have to come before you for a release of conditions of 1.8, and I know I have to come before you for the capital money for construction.
We've had the experience from time to time, I'm sure you have the experience too, that building committees come back with periodic reports that are not necessarily connected to requests for funding. Would not the opportunity exist for us, at your option, to be coming back to us periodically, if you were to so wish, to give us reports on the progress of your decision-making without it being a request for money?
Sure, whenever you want it. I mean, from my standpoint, if you want to see what we did on the 11th, and how we made our decision on the 18th, that's fine. I mean, once again, this is a good amount of taxpayer money. That the more that we get out in front of the information that we reviewed and why we reviewed it and why we made decisions, it's fine with me.
Thank you.
Mr. Finger.
Go
Sorry.
Go ahead, Bill.
I'm opposed to the motion. I've made that clear. I was opposed to even considering the motion. But having heard Mr. Walko and Steve, thank you very much. I would posit that at the very least, there should be some consideration to wording here, because there's a lot of nuances to what's renovation, what's new, and the last thing I would think that any BET member who might consider voting in favor of this motion would want to do was to do something that was directly in contradiction of what the requirements are by charter following ed specs. Ed specs says new building. We can, parse over the words, what's new, what's not new. To me, there'd be a lot of parsing. So I think at the very least, somebody might want to make a motion to at least table this, if not withdraw the motion.
Is there anybody, Mr. Drake?
Thanks for coming before us. Just for the benefit of the BET, would you say, if this were to be passed, will it cost any more money? Will it take any more time? And does it trouble the process in any way?
No, I don't think that it would cost the taxpayers any money. The architect has told us countless times that the meeting that we're going to have on the 11th, they're encouraging us to, quite frankly, we're, if anything, restricting them as opposed to them saying they don't want to do more work. Obviously, there's a limit to that. Their timeline is relatively quick. The timeline is quick because of the budget process, quite frankly, and trying to put the shovel in the ground as soon as possible. We also have a construction manager. We would like to the extent we can afford it, bring a construction manager on for pre-construction services, as I mentioned before. So I don't think it would cost the taxpayers any more money. I would have to find out from Tai-Soo Kim as to whether they have sufficient resources and the like to make sure that they did a good enough job to bring that back to us.
And then let me just wrap up here by saying this decision-making question arises because you got New Lebanon before you and there are millions of dollars at stake. But really what this is a larger question about how you'll carry out your tasks. We will carry out our tasks. When we examine settling some legal case for $10,000 or $15,000, we examine two alternatives. Here, we may not. Let me just read a sentence from Section 21 of our charter, two sentences actually. They say the same thing. Section 21A, Article 2. The proposed budgets shall be presented at such time and in such form and with such content as shall be prescribed by the Board of Estimate and Taxation and shall contain such additional information as is requested by the first selectman or the BET. And the second sentence later on in Article C says pretty much the same thing. Such proposed budgets shall be in such form as the Board of Estimate and Taxation shall prescribe. Gosh, when we examine budgets, we send the appointing authorities back to examine all kinds of alternatives. You do it all the time. We all do it. So that all that's proposed here is to carry out that common sense weighing for this project because it's large. And it's a question of your governance, and that's why I think it's not I think it deserves universal support.
Before I call for the vote on this, Ms. Kiernan?
Bill, I don't think there's any disagreement, again, that more information is good information, and we all appreciate more reporting out by the building committee. I think it would be a great idea if Mr. Walco or another representative continue to keep us informed. We all want that, no question. But I think this maybe is a problem of communication. If we have more information flow on a regular basis, then I'm not sure we would really need this resolution. I'd also like to emphasize again, your resolution is binary. There are two options there.
No.
I heard a lot of different ideas coming from the building committee chairman because
it says at least two.
Okay,
It's not binary.
but it reads to me as a binary choice when you have to vote yes or no on your resolution. Okay, so that is a binary choice. And there are a lot of plans and ideas still being developed by this building committee and by this architect. So again, when we have a sort of a multidimensional problem in front of us, or application and building project in front of us, to reduce our decision-making tonight to a binary choice, you're either for or against this resolution, I think conflates and reduces this to a question that is just simply not in front of us, and simply one we don't have the information about. Let's continue to get information from Steve and continue to be informed, so as all of us have said, when we come to vote on this in March, we know what we're doing.
Mr. Raymer.
So, joining with Ms. Kiernan with her remark, since the chair of the building committee has so graciously said that he would be willing to come and give us these periodic reports, we can hear about the alternatives that are being discussed. We can gather information. If at that point we feel terribly distressed that some alternative should have been considered and hasn't been considered, that's time enough for us to consider whether or not we want to endorse some motion or resolution at that point. At this point, it just feels premature to me.
Mr. Johnson.
Just in response to Mr. Raymer's thought, the problem, Jeff, with that is they may not come back to us with some of these plans for another month or 2 months. And if at that point we say, hey, we'd like to look at a plan that includes a substantial renovation of the existing building as well as an addition, that's going to set them back in time. I mean, we're looking to try to make this as efficient a process as possible so we can get the shovel in the ground. I'd hate to delay things by us deciding 2 months from now we'd like to see another certain option.
So the Drake motion is before you.
Can I ask one more
Yes.
point? This is so flawed, aside from process. What does, if somebody comes back and tells you building A with a renovation is X dollars, and building Y, and the other building, excuse me, new building is Y, you say, okay, I'm going to go for X? You don't have enough information. You have no idea what the difference in the operating costs are. You have no idea what the difference in the reimbursement costs might be. I mean, this is, at putting the best face on this bill, excuse me, but this is lacking, and there's no clarity in this. This is just, seems to me, aside from being out of line, it's, I don't know what it does. It doesn't do anything. I mean, if the building committee has to make a decision, and they have to, presumably, and I've worked with Mr. Walko. I know he's very thorough, he's very meticulous, and I suspect he will lead that building committee that way. I have every confidence that they will do a extensive analysis of different ways of building this new building, however you want to define new. They'll probably look at, I would assume, what the implications are from an operating standpoint, both on dollars and cents in terms of flow for the children. This is bad form in a lot of ways.
So it brings me back to
There's one more comment over here, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Gove. Oh, I'm sorry,
Yes,
Ms. Wesson.
sorry. I think we heard, though, from Steve Walker tonight that what Mr. Drake is recommending as an additional option was really not on the radar screen of the building committee. So what I was hearing was, absent some sort of sense of the meeting, that this is unlikely to surface perhaps until we go through this process. I mean, I agree with you, Bill Finger, that, I mean, you couldn't do this as an X or Y analysis. I mean, it's a very complex analysis, but on the other hand, I do think it's worth having the numbers in the analysis. I can also say, having gone through the Ham Ave experience of a rehab of an existing building, I think there are a lot of challenges that, are even hard to quantify. But I will support it tonight because I think the information is useful.
So before I call for the vote, we sat right at this kiosk during budget deliberations, and we had a project before us that was expensive for what it was. It was a park renovation. People were saying it just can't cost this much. Pier parks didn't cost that much. So the BET decided that we thought a reasonable number was about 25% lower than what was being asked of us. The vote went, the project's underway, and according to last week's budget committee meeting, We must have had some Cheerios in our thought, because it seems to be doing that right now, and it seems like that's going to be a successful project. In this case, my concern all along has been, how do we prevent ourselves from getting to the point where we're asked for the money, and then these questions come up? And voting no is an alternative. Everybody said that. I don't think that's the alternative that the community wants us to be in. I think the community expects education, there's concerns, and I think that's really what it is. Leslie had mentioned modular construction. I've gone on a record to obviously read up a little bit as that's been sort of floated around in the community, off-site construction, I'm sorry. Very interesting. And I think that has a lot of merit, and especially if that could shorten the time frame down for the school being out of service. I think that would be fantastic. But with that said, I still haven't heard anything compelling that, unless we really make our concerns known, how do we stop getting to that position of having to vote no when we have the unknowns? And that's sort of the position I see. I think we're all in agreement. I think we all want to have this project flow. I don't see anybody against it. We've all voted for this project. And I think Stephen coming here tonight was absolutely amazing and educational, and I appreciate that. So it's before us. I did hear a discussion about tabling this for a month or so, or tabling it, because I think the big meeting is coming up before our next meeting. I didn't get a motion on that, but I thought that was a possible choice to this, because there's a lot of merit to what we're talking about here tonight. So, but I didn't get that motion, so. Okay, all those in favor?
Mr. Chairman, did you ask Mr. Drake if he wanted to table the motion?
I did not. I figured he heard the same conversation. Okay. All those in favor, please signify by raising your hand so I can count. 1, 2, 3, 4.
What was that count? So what was it?
I counted 6. Right? Leslie, you were no. So I got 1, 2, 4, 5, 6.
And you?
6, I counted.
Wait a minute. Let us
I counted
rank them.
right.
Yeah, good. So we had Mr. Huffman, we had
Johnson,
Mr.
Mason.
Johnson, Mason, Drake,
Or,
Norton,
who was there?
Weissler.
And those opposed? 1, 2, 3. Better not come up. 4. 4, and those abstaining. 1, 2.
So who
6, 4, 2.
That was Mary Lee and somebody else? Leslie.
6, 4, 2.
Was that passing?
That's the passage.
Yeah, that's passing.
Under Robert's rules, when there's an abstention, you calculate the majority based upon the votes that were yea or nay and
The
ignore the
abstention votes
abstentions.
don't count.
So
So it would pass for that reason.
So it passed. 6-4-2.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. So what is the binding effect now of this resolution? Does this bind us to a particular vote when we vote on the budget in March? So
I
help
would
me,
think so.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, help me understand, what is the binding effect of this resolution now that it's passed?
I think, as Mr. Raymer said earlier, I don't think there's a binding resolution. I think this is as an outright statement by the BET, by the vote taken, for what we're looking for in financing of this project.
So this is an information request, basically?
That's all I ever thought it was.
Well, it was not worded that way, respectfully. Thank you.
Okay, item number 8, approval to invest in the SSGA Russell.
Mr. Chairman, before we get to that, I'd just like to comment that MISA received its TCO for the auditorium on October 1.
Oh.
The first concert was held there on October 3rd, with Greenwich Symphony Orchestra. The Board of Education held its ribbon cutting there on October 7th. And today, October 19th, started the demolition of the existing auditorium, and also the excavation company was there to begin the excavation for the stormwater drain for phases 2 and 3. So phases 2 and 3 have officially begun today.
Oh, boy, here we go. Okay, back to the investment. Mr. Menarsky? Or, I'm sorry, who do I call now? Mr. Drake? Item number 9.
Sure. The retirement board has held the Russell 1000 fund and the Russell 2000 fund and decided that it would be more efficient to own the one rather than the two. And we in the Investment Advisory Committee approved that. I can find the date for you, but absent the date, our recommendation as a committee was that they be done. Mr. Chadwick?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for the...
There's a committee report from the Law Committee.
Oh,
as
I'm
well.
sorry. Okay.
And the body may be astonished to hear that the Law Committee, with incredible nimbleness, found this to be in legal order.
That was a nimble report, too.
Now it's the shortest report.
See, we wore him out on the last item for you, Mr. Chadwick. See, we were thinking
I haven't
ahead.
even gotten started yet. You guys have gone longer than the RTM did to change the town charter for these two investments.
Okay, so discussion on the item. Does anybody have any questions?
I would just like to say that I don't think that we have the expertise on the retirement board to decide when is the time to overweight either large cap or small cap stocks. Frankly, I have probably been the biggest proponent of overweighting small cap in here on the theory that large companies were slowing down and that in order to maintain their growth rate, they would buy up other companies and cut costs. That turned out to be the case, but unfortunately, the big companies bought up each other instead of the small companies. So the difference is not great. Looking at it from the point of view of NEPC, the weighting that we had in the 1,000 versus the 2,000 is about in the same proportion as the 1,000 and 2,000 are within the 3,000 itself. Finally, this will bring us to a reduction in fees, which NEPC was able to get for us. And the annual savings will be $27,000. So that over 5 years, we will save $135,000, and we're paying NEPC $150,000 for their services for the entire time. So I think that is a pretty good bargain. And even if we have the 3,000 and we decide still to overweight small or large companies at some point in time, we can always do that as an overlay to the 3,000. But we don't have to go through this process of every time we make a choice of trying to figure out just what the right proportions are in order to keep things in shape.
Thank you. Questions? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1200. Brings us to budget guidelines, fiscal 16-17. I'll call on our Budget Committee Chair, Mr. Drake. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to give a report on the budget guidelines, the Budget Committee met last week to look at a proposed draft of the budget guidelines, which is dated October 13th and in our packets. The budget guidelines, as written by me, proposed that all town Board of Ed and appointing authority operating budgets be held to a 2% increase over the prior year. They talked about no new net positions versus the prior year. Did express some concern over our rising fixed cost as well as the growing operating deficit of Nathaniel Witherall, as well as the large number of capital projects that are authorized, encumbered, or outstanding, not spent. Overall, the budget guidelines as proposed ask for a mill rate tax increase consistent with prior years to be kept at 3% or less. The committee spent considerable time discussing this and ultimately voted 2-2, so that version of the budget guidelines did not pass.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Finger, did you have a motion?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the adoption for the BET budget guidelines for fiscal year 2006, 2017, and that being the document that is in the packet that was submitted. The indication is actually somewhat incorrect. It was submitted by Ms. Kiernan on behalf of the Democratic Caucus, and that draft of guidelines has a heading on the top of it above the town of Greenwich that says fiscal 17 budget guidelines presented by Democratic Caucus.
Yes.
So in short, again, summarize, I move the adoption of that draft.
Second.
Item is moved to second. Discussion on that, Mr. Finger?
I'll start off the conversation by saying we've been here before as a BET. And with that, I will defer to the two Budget Committee members of our caucus to make the initial comments.
Ms. Kiernan?
Ladies first, I think.
Ms. Kiernan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the fourth year in a row now, we have an alternative set of guidelines presented for a vote by the BET, which was preceded by perhaps a dozen years of bipartisan approach to the guidelines. And for the last 4 years, our colleagues have taken a different approach to the guidelines, both procedurally and substantively. So again, tonight, the Democratic Caucus, as you heard, offers guidelines that we believe are materially different, fiscally prudent, responsible, and useful to the target audience for which they are intended, which are department leaders across all departments and appointing authorities. Briefly, there are three substantive differences. First, we differ on the central purpose of these guidelines. While our colleagues seek to cap the mill rate this evening and lock in operating budgets before they've been proposed by the first selectman, the superintendent of schools, and department leaders, we adhere to the original purpose of guidelines, and this purpose is twofold: to point out the special issues we're going to face in fiscal 17 and to give department leaders suggested guidance as they develop their budgets, no more than that. Everyone should understand that in the last 4 years, department leaders have come to us in the February budget hearings with budget increases that regularly outpace what has been suggested in our colleagues' guidelines. So I think it is reasonable to ask ourselves about the central purpose of these guidelines and whether the time and effort that all of us are putting into these may really be worth it still. The second major substantive difference I want to point out is our approach to the mill rate in the guidelines. As we have noted on a number of occasions, guidelines are addressed to department leaders who do not set the mill rate. The BET sets the mill rate in May of every year. So we question why a hard cap on the mill rate has become a focus of the Republican guidelines in the last 4 years. Our guidelines call for low and predictable mill rate increases, but unlike our colleagues, our guidelines show the restraint, I think, and the prudence to wait until several important things happen. First, when all departments have submitted their budgets to us. Second, until we have audited results from fiscal 15. We only have unaudited right now. And until we get 4 more months of results from fiscal 16, the current fiscal year. And third, until the BET wrestles with critical budget issues that we have this year, like Nathaniel Witherell, healthcare, and the use of fund balance. I'm afraid that our Republican colleagues are fast-forwarding to the May mill rate decision before all of these various budget steps laid out in our charter take place. And we've said this before, this is at best premature, and we believe we serve our community better by making decisions when we are better informed and follow the budget procedure set out in the charter. Third key substantive difference is our approach on operating budgets. While our colleagues seek an across-the-board cap on operating increases at 2% over fiscal 16, we handle operating budgets differently in several ways. First, we asked departments to provide a level service budget, starting with actuals from 2015. And I heard Mr. Rickey talk about how he is calculating this right now for the Board of Education. For non-BOE departments and appointing authorities, we expect an estimated increase of 2.15%. We also, in our guidelines, acknowledge the very important impact of wage increases from collective bargaining agreements, and we attach that to our guidelines. And this makes a 2.0% operating increase simply unrealistic. I hope that everyone understands that when our colleagues talk about a 2.0% cap, when we have 9 collective bargaining units with wage and increment increases that are nowhere near 2%, this really does imply a reduction in municipal services. Our guidelines also acknowledge a differentiation among departments. Certainly small departments, conservation has 3 FTEs, and appointing authorities will find it even more difficult to meet an across-the-board cap of 2.0%. We also acknowledge the unique situation of the Board of Ed budget, which is bigger than all of the other departments and appointing authorities combined. And here we again encourage a level services budget built starting with actuals from 2015. And we expect this would produce an estimated 2.4% increase over the fiscal year 16 budget. And I would just ask that you consider the Board of Ed for a moment, and I'll use the same words I used a year ago. The Board of Ed manages over 10,000 people every single day, if you add up all the students and all the employees across 17 different sites, including Bank. There are 66 towns in Connecticut that have smaller town-wide populations than what the Board of Ed deals with every single day. And they deal with every issue from security in our buildings to mental health to infrastructure maintenance to building projects and, of course, the education of almost 9,000 students. And on top of that, they have unusual initiatives such as digital learning, a racial imbalance, and an achievement gap. Our guidelines also support the capital needed to maintain our schools so we don't underinvest in infrastructure that leads to higher costs in operating budgets and higher costs for replacement facilities in the future. Let me make one final observation about the real challenge with the next budget. The real challenge with the fiscal 17 budget is not operating, it's not capital, it's fixed charges. The large potential increase from Nathaniel Witherell and the contribution we may need to make, the $62 million projected for health care, the $25 million in high amortization debt service, and the $27 million of required contributions we must make this year to fund the $200 million in unfunded actuarial liabilities we have in our pension and OPEB. Those are the issues. The Democratic guidelines acknowledge that fixed charges represent our biggest challenge, and we discourage solving this larger budget problem by whittling away at operating budgets, public education, and basic municipal services. So I would ask and encourage my colleagues to consider voting for this motion in favor of the Democratic guidelines. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Raymer, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My remarks would, of course, track closely to what Ms. Kiernan has said, so let me offer just some thoughts in supplementation. The heart of the difference between the two proposals is found in the first bullet point on page 4 of each of the two sets of guidelines. On the one hand, a constituency proposes that there be a 2% hard cap. It is a way of saying that the priority is on the hard cap and that the programs and policies become secondary. By comparison, the first bullet point on page 4 of the Democratic set of guidelines asks that the departments come forward with the programs together with pricing for legal services, and specifically that they propose what would be their recommended additions, reductions, changes, and efficiencies, together with the price points for those. The difference becomes the priority of, are you focusing on programs against which you make a decision of what we can afford, or are you simply looking at the hard cap of the dollars without regard to what gets sacrificed? In the process of that, for the second year, you put forward in the Republican side an unrealistic expectation of holding operating to 2%. Looking at the school side, the 100s alone are 86% of the budget of the schools. And that 86% is governed largely by a GEA contract, which on the face of it rises by 2.99%. Even after I factor into it some of the efficiencies and circumstances of older, higher-paid employees departing and less expensive ones coming in, I believe we're still looking at about 2.88%. I'm told that the marketplace, for the purpose of settlements, when I say the marketplace, the labor marketplace, is seeing settlements in the range of 2.25 to 2.75. None of that suggests that you can take that budget and squeeze it below a cap of 2.0% without taking cuts that leave you nowhere near level services. Accordingly, it becomes important that we prognosticate to you just an estimate that we think a more realistic level of expectation would be at 2.4%. On the town side, last year there also, you had said we're looking for 2%, and you've said it again this year. But last year, after having created this edict that everything had to be below a 2.0% cut, in fact, you approved the town budget at 2.36%. You approved general government at 4.7%. You approved the police at 3.7%. This year, Silver Shield, as I understand it, their salaries are set to go up by 3-point-something or other percent. How in the world are you going to crowd that into a final budget at 2.0%? Or is it in fact simply that you throw out demands that you have no expectation of being able to meet? And does that then not diminish our credibility with the department heads when we're discussing true budget with them? As Ms. Kiernan pointed out, the real issue here is actually in fixed costs. And in the model that you attach to it, you pick spooky scenarios to scare yourself so that you say that health care is going to go up by 18%, when in fact, if, for example, it goes up by only 12%, it would be a $3 million savings. You use Nathaniel Witherell at 5.9%, even though Nathaniel Witherell came to you and made it pretty plain that you'll be looking, in fact, at $1.3 million less than that. You show school lunch fund as requiring a subsidy of $950,000 when from the presentation that was made to us the other day, 450 or 460 sounds like a much more realistic scenario. You use an expectation of the grand list growing by only 0.3%, and you heard from the assessor today that that's an unrealistically pessimistic scenario. I challenged at the meeting of the Budget Committee that this felt more like it was a political statement than a process of trying to give direction to department heads, and heard the author of the Republican program say, yes, and political statements are important. I think we have lost our way when we write guidelines to the department heads and mean them instead really to be political statements. It's high time we put that process away, not run op-ed articles in the newspapers and the like, and instead sit down and do what we're supposed to be doing, and that is giving guidelines direction to our department heads, not political statements to our public.
Anyone else? Mr. Johnson?
So it's interesting that, well, first of all, my first comment is Ms. Kiernan mentioned that this should be a document to go to the department heads. It is a bigger document than that. It's a far-reaching, more expanded document. And Mr. Raymer, I don't believe I said it was a political statement, but it's more, to my opinion, a business statement. We're trying to set a budget that's going to be within a realm where our taxpayers are going to want to pay a tax increase. So it does go to the first selectman's office, it goes to the RTM, it goes to our taxpayers. Here's what we, the BET, are thinking about, where we'd like to see the budget for next year. So, to me, it was important to have our target of keeping the mill rate increase to 3% or less. Now, one of the things that's interesting that the Ms. Kiernan has taken out of the guidelines is mentioned that the last 4 years, our tax increase has been 2.75% of each of the last 4 years, which is pretty incredible given the recession that we just went through. I think we should be very proud of the fact that that's a low and predictable tax rate, which is kind of our mantra for the BET, low and predictable. They took that out. I thought it also interesting that they want to mention in their document the expectations that operating costs may increase 2.15% for the town and 2.4% for the Board of Ed. May increase? Does that kind of give flexibility to everybody that they don't really have to come in underneath those levels? I think we should have a specific objective of 2.0%. Now, you also mentioned that all the labor contracts, yes, a lot of them are going to be high twos, maybe even over 3%. I think it's about time that we say we want a budget increase of 2.0% and send that to the message of the labor unions that we're serious about having them come down to the level. They can't expect to keep getting increases of 2.9 or 3%. I think they are, or you'd like to see the labor contracts are driving our overall budget. That's not true. We are setting a goal rate, and the labor contract unions, the unions negotiating the contracts, better start thinking about coming and asking for lower levels. So how can we get that? We have an objective of a lower rate than what they're currently doing. We'd like to see those negotiations come down to a lower point. There's no mention of keeping net positions at zero increase, net increase at zero. So you're assuming that departments can come back and ask for more people in their departments? I mean, I think that's kind of opening the gate. Rather than saying we don't want to see any increases in positions, we want to keep services level. Inflation rate is zero. The population has not grown, so why should they increase? If somebody wants to increase in a certain department, it's got to be offset by a decrease in another department. There's no mention of the fact that we are overwhelmed with capital projects in the town. And at least we want to have the chance, next year's budget committee wants to be able to review a lot of those projects, $135 million worth, to make sure they are going to get done at some point soon. And finally, there's a comment in these guidelines as presented that guidelines are not intended to be binding. Well, what does that mean? I mean, the whole idea of guidelines is we want to have people try as hard as possible to come in at our guidelines. If you say they're not intended to be binding, then what's the purpose of issuing guidelines? So I think the language could have been a little different there. It is going to be a very difficult year. I mean, there's a lot of issues, and as we mentioned, fixed costs and all that, but I think a lot was said last year when we came out with a 2.0% increase in operating as a guideline, and most of the town departments, as well as the Board of Ed, came in at 2.0%. So I think the Republican version of the guidelines, as presented the first time, is the way to go.
Yes, as the fourth member of the Budget Committee, I want to make a few comments here. First, I think the Republican guidelines better reflect the economy in which this town is operating. Earlier today, our Governor Malloy, announced that the state will have to make another almost $120 million in budget cuts, largely because of the downturn on Wall Street and the fact that personal incomes have not risen as much as anticipated. And I think this town obviously has many people and has had many people that work in Wall Street, and we're certainly, as we will see in our revaluations, there will be shifts within neighborhoods, and we'll see the impact of this Wall Street downturn and the impact it will have on our town and on our real estate values and hence property taxes. I'd also like to comment that the inflation rate, which we're talking about, is running, again, by the BLS, for the CPI in our own region, has been hovering around 0% on a, every month of this calendar year on a rolling 12 basis. And so at the beginning of the year, it was a negative 0.5%. And each month since then, it's been hovering around 0, a plus 0.1 or a minus 0.1, but basically 0. So the budget as proposed by the Republicans is still substantially higher than the inflation rate, and we have many people in town that are struggling to pay the taxes as they are now. And they have been, building year after year, and I think we can't forget the compounded rate impact of those taxes. And finally, another sort of outside factor here is that last Thursday it was announced that there'll be no increase in Social Security, no inflation rate increases. This is the third time in the last 10 years. We have many seniors in this town that are dependent upon their Social Security and the cost of living increases. But to balance that out, their Medicare costs will be increasing in the same period. I think it's our responsibility to manage the delivery of services that our town expects, but to do it in a manner that is, paced and balanced. And I believe the version that was prepared in the Budget Committee, as Mark pointed out by him, does exactly that. And that's why I voted for that version.
Just going to reiterate, last year when we had this discussion, there had been a lot of skepticism. Could we achieve the 2%? Yes, we didn't get to totally the 2%. We got to 2.15%, but certainly within that, if we were looking at various departments, Public Works, the third largest department in the town, came in at flat as a result of improvements and looking at their single stream recycling. So there's a lot of creative aspects that I think approaching the budget in terms of achieving efficiencies. If you set a target, if you were running a company, you're not just going to say, well, do your best. I think that's the message here. And I think here what we're doing is saying within the same message for both the Republicans and Democrats, we're looking for low and predictable tax increases. Absent a target, I don't think we're going to be able to achieve that. And, there's no reference to, in the Democratic version, what that gap is of being $10 million or, if you were to play the numbers out, this would result in a 6% increase in the mill rate. And so I certainly would not consider that consistent with low and predictable tax increase.
I think Sean was first, likely.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just on the theme of process, I just point out for the people who might be watching this or the public who are interested, the way the guidelines process works is that only the Republican Budget Committee chairman may introduce a budget guidelines, and the other members during this process may submit ideas or suggestions to him, but a separate budget guidelines cannot be considered on its own until the last minute, which is happening here, only through a parliamentary procedure, in which one has to propose a substitute amendment. And that's simply not right. Members should be permitted, if they have come up with a budget guidelines, to have those submitted and considered by the Budget Committee or the full BET during a work session or what have you over the course of that entire process and not be cut out until the final moment. In terms of this document, I think there are some interesting things here. First, I note that in what is called the Democratic guidelines, there is a mention of tipping fees at Holly Hill Resource Recovery Center, and that, let's see, the BET is interested in reviewing tipping fees. Well, When Randy Huffman and I proposed our guidelines a year ago, we proposed the tipping fee in there. We put it in and said that it needs to be in there, and there was outrage that we would put in something that can only be passed by the Board of Selectmen. What a difference a year makes. Here it is. I'd also point out that we put in a higher use of fund balance, which has to be done. And here, that was considered irresponsible. Here we say, given the larger, or this document says, given the larger variables such as the town's contribution to Nathaniel Witherall, et cetera, it is likely that the use of fund balance will increase again in fiscal year 17, and it might next year. Well, we told you so. And we told you that it should be higher, and you all voted it down. Now, both of these documents, the one that will be considered in this one, say we're looking for low and predictable increases. And yet, the guidelines last year that Randy Huffman and I proposed, and which included a 4-year projection, showed how to keep taxes, property taxes, virtually flat for that period of time. And that's the only one that's been proposed so far that does that. I would just like to ask, in Exhibit 1, which has a 6.4% property tax increase, this is attached to Ms. Kieran's document. It seems to be the same one as what will come up in the Republican document. Is this, am I correct that this is the same projection?
The examples go with both.
Examples go with both. So there's been talk about this being a partisan documents.
The examples, for clarification, I believe, are not built by either caucus. I think they're actually Roland built those.
Right. And might I point out that when Mr. Huffman and I did this, we built in not only a model for the economy for that year, but for 4 years, and showed the full effect of putting in our proposals, including long-term financing. And we did something which is mentioned in these documents, which is prioritizing, and we showed transparency in terms of what projects we would actually fund in what year, and what this town needed in terms of maintenance and repairs and the baseline capital budget, none of which is in here. So I don't see in this document any different.
You know, I think a lot was said last year when we came out with a 2.0% increase in operating as a guideline, and most of the town departments, as well as the Board of Ed, came in at 2.0%. So I think the Republican version of the guidelines, the as presented the first time, is the way to go.
Yes, as the fourth member of the Budget Committee, I want to make a few comments here. First, I think the Republican guidelines better reflect the economy in which this town is operating. Earlier today, our Governor Malloy, announced that the state will have to make another almost $120 million in budget cuts, largely because of the downturn on Wall Street and the fact that personal incomes have not risen as much as anticipated. And I think this town obviously has many people and has had many people that work in Wall Street, and we're certainly, as we will see in our revaluations, there will be shifts within neighborhoods, and we'll see the impact of this Wall Street downturn and the impact it will have on our town and on our real estate values, and hence property taxes. I'd also like to comment that the inflation rate, which we're talking about, is running, again, by the BLS, for the CPI in our own region, has been hovering around 0% on a every month of this calendar year on a rolling 12 basis. And so at the beginning of the year, it was a negative 0.5%. And each month since then, it's been hovering around 0, a plus 0.1 or a minus 0.1, but basically 0. So the budget as proposed by the Republicans is still substantially higher than the inflation rate, and we have many people in town that are struggling to pay the taxes as they are now. And they have been, building year after year, and I think we can't forget the compounded rate impact of those taxes. And finally, another sort of outside factor here is that last Thursday it was announced that there'll be no increase in Social Security. No inflation rate increases. This is the third time in the last 10 years. We have many seniors in this town that are dependent upon their Social Security and the cost of living increases. But to balance that out, their Medicare costs will be increasing in the same period. I think it's our responsibility to manage the delivery of services that our town expects, but to do it in a manner that is, paced and balanced. And I believe the version that was prepared in the Budget Committee, as Mark pointed out by him, does exactly that. And that's why I voted for that version.
Just going to reiterate, last year when we had this discussion, there had been a lot of skepticism. Could we achieve the 2%? Yes, we didn't get to totally the 2%. We got to 2.15%, but certainly within that, if we were looking at various departments, Public Works, the third largest department in the town, came in at flat as a result of improvements and looking at their single stream recycling. So there's a lot of creative aspects that I think approaching the budget in terms of achieving efficiencies. If you set a target, if you were running a company, you're not just going to say, well, do your best. I think that's the message here. And I think here what we're doing is saying, within the same message for both the Republicans and Democrats, we're looking for low and predictable tax increases. Absent a target, I don't think we're going to be able to achieve that. And, there's no reference to, in the Democratic version, what that gap is of being $10 million, or, if you were to play the numbers out, this would result in a 6% increase in the mill rate. And so I certainly would not consider that consistent with low and predictable tax increase.
I think Sean was first, likely.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just on the theme of process, I just point out for the people who might be watching this or the public who are interested, the way the guidelines process works is that only the Republican Budget Committee chairman may introduce a budget guidelines, and the other members during this process may submit ideas or suggestions to him, but a separate budget guidelines cannot be considered on its own until the last minute, which is happening here, only through a parliamentary procedure, in which one has to propose a substitute amendment. And that's simply not right. Members should be permitted, if they have come up with a budget guidelines, to have those submitted and considered by the Budget Committee or the full BET during a work session or what have you over the course of that entire process, and not be cut out until the final moment. In terms of this document, I think there are some interesting things here. First, I note that in what is called the Democratic guidelines, there is a mention of tipping fees at Holly Hill Resource Recovery Center, and that, let's see, the BET is interested in reviewing tipping fees. Well, when Randy Huffman and I proposed our guidelines a year ago, we proposed the tipping fee in there. We put it in and said that it needs to be in there, and there was outrage that we would put in something that can only be passed by the Board of Selectmen. What a difference a year makes. Here it is. I'd also point out that we put in a higher use of fund balance, which has to be done. And here, that was considered irresponsible. Here we say, given the larger or This document says, given the larger variables such as the town's contribution to Nathaniel Witherall, et cetera, it is likely that the use of fund balance will increase again in fiscal year 17, and it might next year. Well, we told you so, and we told you that it should be higher, and you all voted it down. Now, both of these documents, the one that will be considered in this one, say we're looking for low and predictable increases, and yet the guidelines last year that Randy Huffman and I proposed, and which included a 4-year projection, showed how to keep taxes, property taxes, virtually flat for that period of time. And that's the only one that's been proposed so far that does that. I would just like to ask, in Exhibit 1, which has a 6.4% property tax increase, this is attached to Ms. Kieran's document. It seems to be the same one as what will come up in the Republican document. Is this, am I correct that this is the same projection?
The examples go with both.
Examples go with both. So there's been talk about this being a partisan document.
The examples, for clarification, I believe, are not built by either caucus. I think they're actually rolling built those.
Right. And might I point out that when Mr. Huffman and I did this, we built in not only a model for the economy for that year, but for 4 years, and showed the full effect of putting in our proposals, including long-term financing. And we did something which is mentioned in these documents, which is prioritizing, and we showed transparency in terms of what projects we would actually fund in what year, and what this town needed in terms of maintenance and repairs and the baseline capital budget, none of which is in here. So I don't see in this document any difference in terms of numbers from what the Republicans have in theirs, except that here there's no mill rate increase or mill rate cap or even a range. And there's one thing that Mr. Huffman and I did. We had a discipline. We showed how to keep taxes not only low and predictable, but virtually flat. And you voted against that. So, you know, I think it's a very good thing for the people in this room that nobody actually has to face the voters. But I don't see a partisan document here. I don't see much difference between either, except that, as Ms. Weissler pointed out, one has a wish number in terms of the mill rate increase, although that increase is half of what our finance department says the increase will be. Sorry?
That document that you and Randy submitted, how could that be? You said that nobody can institute a set of budget guidelines, so
Until the parliamentary procedure at the end of the process.
that's just not.
It is accurate. You refuse to permit that to be.
Some of the things that you said, I just want to just clarify. Sorry. Okay. Who do I have next? That was Mr. Blankley's next, followed by Mr. Finger.
So what I have to say, Mr. Chairman, largely supplementary to the comments made by our Budget Committee members on the Democratic side. So I just have a couple of additional points. So I guess for the second time this evening, I can talk about my business experience as applied to a situation. I did it already with the school lunch fund, and I'll do it now with regard to budgets. I've been doing budgets for 45 years and dealt with budgets significantly larger than this and significantly larger than the budget of the whole state of Connecticut, as a matter of fact. And a very important part of those budgets was the creative process, and I was heartened to hear that from Ms. Weissler, as a matter of fact. But I would take it a stage further in terms of what we can do creatively. Departments in the companies that I used to work for would come forward with their budgets. They'd be given a certain guideline. You know, you can't be excessive, but we want to know what you can do creatively to improve services. We want to know what you can do creatively to improve efficiencies so that those services can be delivered in a way which enables us to meet a target, which incidentally I respect, the idea of low and predictable tax increases. I think that is a suitable goal. It is not a suitable goal to say to our departments, thou shalt stick at 2%. That's a deadening diktat, and it makes no sense whatsoever in the light of the point that my colleagues have already made, that if you are having wage increases between 2.5% and 3%, how can you possibly, and those represent major parts of each department's budget, how the budget then overall for each department can be brought down to 2% is only by cutting back on services. And that is we want to make the political statement. I will make it right now. That is not anything that the town wants. It does want low and predictable taxes, but it does not want town services to be cut back as a result of this imposition that you would put forward in your budgeting. So, small point on process. I regard guidelines as guidelines to departments. The way that the document is currently constructed, it is actually a two-part document. I can go with the background that we should be giving about current economic conditions and problems facing us like fixed charges and so on and so forth. But in the end, that doesn't really matter to department heads. But whatever, it is guidelines to departments. The second part of the document is really and truly a BET working document. It's how we in the BET, come next April, May, will cope with what is before us. It will go through the budget committee process, but we then will have the levers in terms of taxing, borrowing, and use of fund balance. And to my mind, there is not a lot of point in talking about any of that in guidelines to departments.
Mr. Finger, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to add a few things to some of the things that have been said. The reason why you will find in our draft of guidelines the phrase that these are not meant to be binding is because we mean they're not meant to be binding. And in fact, last year's guidelines, which were purported to be binding, the guidelines that were passed, ended up not being binding by virtue of the fact that, as was pointed out by both Mr. Raymer and Ms. Kiernan, the operating lines for the town increased by 2.15% as opposed to the approved guideline dictate of 2%. Last year, similar to this year, maybe not quite as large, as great an influence as they will be this year, fixed charges is where the budget, where the mill rate ended up being formulated and being helpful, or fixed charges is where we were able to make the biggest savings in creating the mill rate, the low mill rate that was approved. We are proud, I think, I am, that we've been able as a BET to pass budgets in the last 3 or 4 years at 2.75%. But I will point out, or I'd like to point out, that had it not been for the Republicans, we would have had a budget last year of 2.03%, which is what the budget was that came out of the Budget Committee and was the motion that was made by, I believe it was Ms. Kiernan or myself. I don't recall who made that motion, but it was not passed. It was defeated or didn't pass because it only received 6 votes, the 6 Democrats on the BET. So this is very early in the process, as been pointed out, and last year's budget makes it crystal clear that we are too early to be setting dictates. There's a lot of things that have to happen. And if we only look back to last year, we find evidence with more information, we're able to craft the budget, which is what this body is supposed to do, and Right now, we should be taking the best information that we have and just giving guidelines to the departments so that they understand where we think they should be or where we think the budget's going to be, recognizing that the heavy lifting is going to be done by this body when we start dealing with fixed charges. And there may not be a lot of room because of the fact that they are fixed charges. But to start putting the burden on the departments, I think is misplaced.
Further? Okay. I'm sorry, Ms. Kiernan?
I just want to, Mr. Chairman, if I could clear up two comments. There was a comment about the 9 unions in our community coming forward and submitting to lower wage increases. Certainly, all of us would like to see reductions in wages. Okay, no one is arguing with that, but we have to understand how the collective bargaining process works. And because Mr. Mason and I sit through this every summer, we're very, very familiar. We are, to quote somebody on the Labor Contracts Committee who's not in my party, the victim of pattern bargaining, okay? We are subject to what else goes on in the state, because if you do not settle, you will go to arbitration, and arbitrators are not going to pick the dot off the graph. They're going to pick an outcome that is well in line with what is going on in the rest of the state. So I think it's really wishful thinking to think we're going to be able to make a huge dent in our budget by demanding that the unions come in and submit to wage decreases. The second point I'd like to make responds to a comment about how high the requests are for the capital projects this year. And we heard some of this discussion during the New Lebanon project resolution discussion. It doesn't matter if the requests are $93 million or $23 million. The capital tax levy is going up $3 million. It does not matter how much departments are asking for. That is the debt policy, and that is the capital financing model that we passed 7-6 last month. And one of our biggest concerns about that is there is no variation in that capital tax levy, no matter what is going on with our capital needs, no matter how much departments request. So it's a little inconsistent, I think, to throw that out as a big problem. Our capital financing system does not look at how much we need to finance. We simply increase the capital tax levy by $3 million, almost 1% of the mill rate every single year, no matter what. Thank you.
Okay. I'll let it go. Okay, all those in favor?
So the vote before us is
On the
Democratic.
one labeled F, fiscal year 17 budget guidelines presented by Democratic Caucus. Let me just find my agenda so I make sure I'm. Okay, all those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Only one name.
Huh.
Sorry.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm showing 7.
Right?
7 against, 5 in favor,
Because Mr. Goldrick is.
5, 7, 0.
No, wait a minute. I think I did not vote in favor.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Just do it again.
So this is on the.
Raise your hands
Democratic
if you're
version.
in favor of this document. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed? There we go. There we go.
Just so between Catherine and me, we get it squared away.
4, 8, 0.
So it was 480, and the 4 were, just to be sure, 4 in favor were,
Mr. Blankley,
Yep.
Mr. Raymer, Mr. Finger, Ms. Kieran.
thank you.
Mr. Johnson.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a motion that we approve the budget guidelines draft dated October 13th, 2015. That was included in our document.
Moved and seconded. Discussion?
I assume that that document then would also then take into itself the 3 exhibits, but not the appendix from the Democratic draft.
Yes, the exhibits were not doubled up.
I just wanted clarity on the record.
No, in the packages, I was saying how big did the file want to be? We've had a lot of discussion. I've heard a lot of things about I and they and you, and instead of the we. There's a lot of we in a room here. You know, you could address every issue, you know, the capital tax levy going up. The capital tax levy pays for both cash projects and debt service. The debt service is not as high as the capital tax levy. But the process that we follow, I hear talk about process. This year, we had a special budget committee meeting to maintain the process. But more than that, forget the back and forth. The budget is built up of revenues, expenses, and commitments. We make many commitments in every budget year that are not cash commitments. They're commitments. We're going to do Little Eb School, so we need money for A&E, but we don't need the $30 million this year because they got to do the A&E before we get to that. Revenues. Last year, we were blessed with the trend starting to rise a little bit on the revenues, and I think that came into play. We talk about fund balance. The last year was a year we decided to increase use of fund balance. Yes, that has been recommended by people. We also, in the same budget, chose to address a future liability of the town, OPEB, that we hadn't fully funded the ARC in the past, and we chose as a board to do that. The budget is a lot of things. We learned a lot. You heard in the discussions tonight in the report on the labor contracts. At the time, both drafts probably should have had that, but those negotiations were going on. But I think that's what this board needs to focus on. How can we address that big labor hurdle, which is our healthcare? Healthcare, I heard somebody say we're estimating 18%, but it's really only going to be 14%. It really is going to be a split rate between the first half of the year and the second half of the year. Those are real numbers. And when we look at the models that Roland pulled up, you know, there's certain assumptions in there, and I think the budget committee went back and forth on those. Overall, I would be the first one to say this. I think Mr. Finger said this is going to be a difficult year. I think this will be the most difficult year because of what Ms. Kiernan said also about fixed charges. So I think there's a lot of we that are going to have to look at these challenges going forward. And all the solutions, you know, we'll come up with them. February is usually a busy month. So with that said, unless anybody has anything else, I'll call for the vote on if anybody has any comments, because I think the comments in the first one are on both. Mr. Waldrick?
Yeah, again on process, if I may. And Mr. Finger alluded to this time and a year ago as well. These guidelines are called, excuse me, guidelines to department heads, which I find kind of curious because, you know, getting back to our previous discussion, when it was said we can't tell the Board of Ed what to do with their building project, and yet we always tell the Board of Ed what to do, including their recommendations on the school lunch fund came as a direct result of a resolution from this board. Now, the department heads don't report to us. They report to the first selectman. So properly, and the department heads are not responsible generally for their salary increases. That's the responsibility of the first selectman's office and his labor negotiator. It frequently, these settlements are done across departments. So, you know, moving forward, I think the BET on guidelines should be more clear about you're giving advice to the first selectman on labor contracts. The second thing is, right before I joined this board about 4 years ago, did a little spreadsheet. And it came out that 3/4 of the budget increase for the previous 5 years had come from non-salary items. And the same is the case, if not more, for the last 4 years. So this is one thing that Randy Huffman and I did in our guidelines, was to acknowledge that, in fact, it's not the department heads or the first selectmen that need guidance. It's this board, because most of these variables are variables that are controlled, or at least tried to be controlled by the BET. Fund balance use, debt policy, and healthcare is one which we do not have a handle on at this point. But, you know, we're pretending that this is department heads' guidelines, and it's really not. In fact, if that's all it was, it would be a small portion of this budget. Now, the other thing I'd point out, just on this, if you had adopted our guidelines a year ago, property taxes would have gone down, and they would have been roughly flat using the same variables, the same final healthcare figures and so on that were across the board. So the fact that we're looking at, we had almost a 3% increase this year, and you're looking at 6.4% and trying to hold it to 3%, you know, you didn't have to do that. So I would just point that out. And the other thing is, once again, you've got over a 6% increase in property taxes. You say you're keeping it down to 3%, but you're not saying how. You're not saying which capital projects have to be cut back or where. And in fact, most of this budget is set. Right? You're hoping that you're getting a change in healthcare or in OPEB or Nathaniel Witherall. But the fact is, the main levers on the budget are controlled by this board.
Okay. Okay. All those in favor of the Republican draft?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, that vote is 6-6, and I will vote in favor of the draft, so it's 7-6-0. Okay, moving on. Long night. Next item on the agenda is our meeting calendar. I distributed everyone. Everybody's had this for about a month. I've circulated it to our current members coming on board. I've made as many of the changes as I possibly could make from the input I've gotten back from people. Ms. Tarkington told me about a law committee that might be changing by an hour, but I didn't change it because the day is right, the time, you can just make that adjustment the day. You're not changing a day or a room. Getting the rooms is the most important, so this is something we typically do in October. Elaine is working on, am I right, Peter, working on locking down all these rooms and everything for us, so that's quite a process. So with that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes?
So, Mike, is it somehow indicated, for those of us who have already put all of this in our calendars, is there an indication of what has changed since the last draft of this?
Just some of the February meetings.
Yeah. Can I find that out from?
Yes, Elaine will give you, I'm sorry,
Okay.
Elaine can do that. And also, we changed something in October, I forget what that was, and we changed our June meeting, I think we changed the starting time. We can start earlier, so if there's an item a department needs approved, that needs to go on the RTM agenda that night. In other words, so we're not behind the RTM in the month of June, which has been a problem.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Raymer.
You're showing, perhaps it's an error, BET HR meeting in February as being both the 9th and the 11th. I have a feeling that the 11th is an error, but.
Can I just clarify that, Jeff?
Sorry, thank you.
Given that there are new position requests, and assuming there will be, typically, the HR committee would entertain those after the first selectman's budget, and usually it's a 2-day process,
Oh, I
hear
see.
them and
So
vote.
it's not an error,
So
it's
it,
intended.
I think, would depend on the HR committee coming in and how many requests to put before.
Sorry, I misunderstood. Thank you, Nancy.
Plus, obviously, we had a Board of Eds, we're working around your holiday schedule. So that's pretty much included here, I'm pretty sure, anyway, I hope. Okay, all those in favor of the October calendar for next year?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining?
I'm not going to be here, so.
Mr. Finger abstained.
You may not have a quorum if you ask for those who.
Oh, boy.
Don't forget the dinner.
Okay, no, that's not here. Old business, I had nothing. Minutes?
So moved.
Second.
I have a major change, Mr.
Uh-oh,
Chairman.
uh-oh.
It was noted that I made the motion to adjourn. That was not the case. It was Ms. Weisler who made the motion to adjourn.
Okay.
Do credit.
With that duly noted, can I get a motion that the minutes are approved? How would he remember that? Okay, moved. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, Mr. Blankley, in order to make the minutes accurate, which motion would you like to give tonight? The second or the motion to adjourn?
I will assume the usual position, Mr. Chairman, motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Good night, everyone.